A beautiful noblewoman, with deep violet eyes and long black hair, like a silk veil, sat on the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and her lips could barely utter words of plea for salvation to the man who stood next to her, and her name was Rudis Amaryllis. The fragile figure of the young lady visibly trembled as she knelt down like a broken flower before the majestic throne on which sat the ruler of this great power himself, while around her, like silent statues, stood the haughty aristocrats. The emperor looked gloomily at the young lady. His name was Bartold Amaryllis, and he was a man whose stern appearance was emphasized by a thick beard. His eyes showed the unbending will of a ruler, and a fur cape, a symbol of his power, rested heavily on his broad shoulders. Suddenly, the ruler, shaking the walls of the hall, exclaimed in a thunderous voice, pointing a heavy finger at the marble floor in front of the special guests, declaring that the long-awaited peace would come to the empire only when one of the nobles was sacrificed. Rudis burst into even more bitter tears, realizing that her own father was prepared without a shadow of a doubt to discard her as an unnecessary pawn in a political game, and let her die for the sake of an ephemeral peace that might never come. A merciless attack fell upon their country, monstrous monsters filled the lands, and ordinary citizens died in the thousands. Their groans and screams filled the streets, and the only hope remained the help of the ancient gods, but to call upon them, a sacrifice was required. Rudis admitted in a trembling voice that she had always known about this terrible ritual, but desperately wanted to live. Her heart was squeezed with horror, and next to the ruler stood a luxuriously dressed lady whose gaze, full of superiority and cold contempt, was like a sharp blade. The young beauty froze in place, her breath caught, a chill ran across her skin, and beads of sticky sweat rolled down her face as she realized that the lot had fallen on her, that she had been called upon to die for the greater good, sacrificing her life to save ordinary citizens. Her birth father suddenly roared loudly, his voice booming through the vaults of the hall, like thunder bringing down upon his daughter the cruel truth that the victim had to be someone from the royal family, and everyone in this room knew this from the very beginning, except perhaps Rudis herself. From childhood the man was cruel to her, knew neither pity nor affection, and for any, even the smallest offense, he severely punished her, without thinking about the pain he caused, because in his eyes she always remained unworthy, not what he wanted. When she looked up in fear, it turned out that next to the emperor, full of grace and confidence, stood her own sister, Selena, dazzling in her grandeur, with a proud posture, golden hair shimmering like sunlight, and a bold smile. When the knight priest dared to speak boldly, objecting that Selena, possessing impeccable royal blood, was a more suitable candidate for the sacrifice, Bartold did not even let him finish, cutting him off rudely and angrily, his voice booming like a clap of thunder. The ruler did not look for excuses, did not pretend to be hypocritical. His face glistened with sweat, but his gaze remained heavy and gloomy, as he unhesitatingly uttered the cruel truth, admitting that Rudis, born of a simple woman, had always been in his eyes a stain on his family dirt. Rudis, sitting on the icy marble floor, her whole body shaking with sobs, her hands clasped in front of her in despair, in supplication, suddenly froze as if struck by lightning. Her tears froze on her pale cheeks, her mouth opened in a silent scream, and animal horror froze in her eyes. Suddenly, as if coming from nowhere, thick sulfur smoke began to spread rapidly across the hall, its dark curtains trembling from the running crimson sparks, like hot coals, and sensing a strange presence, the princess turned back sharply. Her father, without the slightest concealment of his usual mockery, coldly remarked that his unloved daughter should be glad, because at least this time she would prove useful, giving her insignificant life for the good of the great empire in which she had never managed to take a worthy place. The high priest, a young man with an unwavering expression, who stood next to the ruler, nodded calmly, confirming that such was the will of the gods, and if the sacrifice was made, the deity would surely hear the prayers, granting the kingdom the long-awaited deliverance. Rudis, without ceasing, begged her parent for mercy. With a broken voice, her desperate requests breaking into silent sobs, she bowed again and again, begging not to be sent to death, and in this fit of despair, she hit her forehead on the stone floor. But Bartold, without even flinching coldly, extended his hand and pointed his finger at his daughter, with an indifferent gesture, after which the knights, obeying a silent order, immediately grabbed her hands, squeezing her wrists tightly, not allowing her to break free, and despite her desperate resistance, The noblewoman, torn apart by despair, cried out to her sister in a heart-rending voice, her cry trembling in the air full of plea, hope, and horror. She called Selina by name, begging her to intercede for her to protect her, not to allow her to be sent to certain death, but she only watched silently. Bartold, without hiding a drop of cruelty, sternly, loudly, and clearly, pronounced the final sentence, ordering that his daughter be immediately given over to the deity, to be torn to pieces, so that her blood would become the price for saving those who were truly dear to him. Rudice, deprived of the strength to fight, felt herself being pushed forward sharply. Her body lost its balance, her dress fluttered in the air, her hands darted upward in a last attempt to cling to life, but her chest was squeezed by a chilling fear. Her lips remained open in a silent scream. Almost mad with terror, she fell to her knees in the damp, cold dungeon, her fingers sliding convulsively along the stone floor, until she tore the skin raw, rubbing them with all her might, until they bled, begging without ceasing for freedom, asking at least someone to let her out of this confinement. The lady found herself in the center of a ritual circle, outlined by glowing red seals, her voice trembling as she begged for mercy, but her pleas were drowned out in the thick air saturated with magic, for the ritual had already begun, and the high priest began to call upon the ancient deity. Rudy screamed as a sudden piercing pain pierced her mind like a blade. Her fingers dug into her hair, her head burned with an unbearable heat, and around her, on the rune-carved stones, trembling and vibrating, a magical glow blazed. When the noblewoman, having lost all sense of time, slowly opened her eyes, she realized that she was in absolute blackness, in a void without walls, without a sky, without sounds. Only eternal darkness stretched around, and nowhere, neither near nor far, was a single living soul visible. She froze in place, standing in tense silence, her hand trembling, stretched out forward, as if trying to feel for something in the darkness. But at that very moment, her body was frozen with primal terror, when suddenly a heavy cold breath was clearly heard behind her. Rudice immediately took off running, without looking back, through the impenetrable darkness, her heart pounding her breath, ragged. But suddenly, she heard a faint ringing sound. A silver hairpin, decorated with an elegant butterfly, suddenly slipped out of her hair. Clutching the jewel desperately, she overcame her fear and put all her remaining strength into one swift blow, without hesitation, plunging the elegant pin into the dark monster that loomed over her, hoping that the tip of the silver would pierce its flesh and grant her salvation. Scarlet blood flowed in hot streams down her wrist, leaving burning marks on her skin, but her fingers convulsively clutched the metal as if it were the last thread connecting her to life. And in this desperate grip, one could see not only pain, but also boundless determination. When de Rudice, barely breathing, opened her eyes, she was overcome with a chilling horror, because just a few steps away, monstrously close, two huge, unblinking eyes of a monster gleamed, looking straight at her, and his bottomless body, as if woven from darkness itself, trembled. The noblewoman recoiled with a piercing scream, but fear gripped her body, preventing her from even moving, and she, her eyes wide open, froze in a terrifying stupor, unable to tear her gaze away from the eerie silhouette that seemed to be absorbing the light. Rudy suddenly felt the strength leaving her body, and at that moment, a painful image flashed before her eyes. She remembered how she once begged her father for help, but he only coldly turned away, leaving her alone with despair, and yet all she wanted was to just live. Consciousness slowly slipped away from the aristocrat, like morning fog, dispersed by a gust of wind, but before the darkness completely swallowed her, she suddenly seemed to see someone standing next to her, a man with golden eyes, whose gaze penetrated into the very depths of her soul. And indeed, when Rudice finally lost consciousness, someone's strong hands with incredible care caught her fragile body, not allowing her to collapse onto the cold stone, and it was a young man with blue-black hair and a wild, dangerous look. It all felt like a bad dream in which the past and present were intertwined into one frightening reality, because now, even while unconscious, she again saw her father's figure in front of her, and realized that she was kneeling before him just as helplessly as she had been a long time ago. Bartold, however, was full of rage, his scowl radiating contempt, and his haughty voice sounded cold and distant as he spoke without flinching of the need for sacrifice, as if her fate was already sealed and feelings had no meaning. As the dark tendrils of magic began to writhe entangling her fragile body and pulling her into the abyss. The lady screamed, begging her father for help and mercy with all her might, but his eyes did not reflect a drop of compassion, only a cold gleam reminiscent of the sentence. With stern mercilessness, he reminded her that she was only a child born of a simple worthless commoner, with filthy blood in her veins, and that her existence had been a mistake from the very beginning, unworthy of either love or mercy. The noblewoman froze in shock when Bartold, without even softening, threw it in her face with bitter contempt that such a pathetic creature as she would never be able to find her happiness because her fate was predetermined from birth and she had nothing left but pain. Indeed, for 20 long years now, Rudis had lived as if in an endless nightmare because she was born with a disability that made her an outcast, forcing her to fight every day for existence in a world where there was no place for her. Her leg had been crippled since birth, making every step a struggle, and unable to bear the ridicule and disdainful glances, she quickly withdrew into herself, remaining only a dim shadow against the backdrop of her shining sister, whose golden hair shimmered in the sun. She did not demand much from her father, did not expect wealth or fame, but only quietly dreamed that he, at least for a moment, would give her a piece of his love. But he only sat on his majestic throne, looking down at her as if she were something insignificant, unworthy of his attention and care. But in the end, Bartold didn't even try to pretend that he cared about her, but instead, without hesitation, signed his daughter's death warrant, while she, trembling with despair, knelt before him, begging not for power, not for forgiveness, but simply for the right to live. Her shoulders shook with loud sobs, and her cheeks, burning with tears, burned painfully, because her whole soul was torn apart by unbearable injustice, and the only question that tormented her heart was simple and bitter. Why did her father never love her the way she loved him? And suddenly, through the veil of pain and resentment, a distant memory emerged before her inner eye. Early spring, she barefoot and happy runs out of her dark room, feeling freedom for the first time in a long time, and the warm sun gently touches her skin. If fate had given her a second chance, she would no longer cling to a family that despised her. She would not have looked for love where it never existed, but would simply run away, leaving the past behind, and live a free life where she would not have to beg for someone's favor. But suddenly, Rudis opened her eyes sharply, and breathing heavily, realized that she was lying on a soft bed, her head resting on the pillow, and the warm light of the lamp softly illuminated the room. And this stunned her, because at the last moment, before losing consciousness, she was sure that she was dying. She remembered how her body was torn apart by unbearable pain, her stomach was cramping, and every breath was so difficult that it seemed that just a little more, and her lungs would simply refuse to work, and then she would disappear, dissolve into the darkness, just as those who condemned her to death wanted. Moreover, she clearly remembered that terrible moment when she, completely exhausted, was roughly pushed into the center of the ritual circle, thrown like an unnecessary thing, without saying a word, because for them, she was just a victim and instrument. The aristocrat jumped up, clutched her head convulsively, and from a sudden rush of memories, she felt sick. Her heart pounded wildly, and horror again squeezed her throat, and squeezing her temples, she tried to come to her senses, but before her eyes were still images of the nightmare she had experienced. It turned out that she was not alone in the room at all. A multitude of maids were bustling around, and among them stood out a noble lady whose face expressed nothing but expectation, and as soon as Rudy showed signs of life, a whisper rolled through the room. The princess had finally woken up. The bedroom she found herself in was magnificent. Gilded furniture sparkled in the rays of the morning sun, curtains adorned the walls, and the air was filled with the light scent of flowers. But the most amazing thing was that all the servants, as if on command, hastily bowed before her. In confusion, she glanced at the girls who were sitting on their knees in a deep curtsy, their heads respectfully lowered, and despite the change in the environment, she managed to discern familiar faces in their features. But the dryness in her throat did not allow her to utter a single word. With incomprehension and growing anxiety, Rudis realized that all these ladies had once been close friends of her sister, and now, despite their submissiveness, they could hardly hide their hostility because they hated her with all their souls, the one who, for so many years, remained nothing but trash to them. One of the noblewomen lowered her gaze, and with feigned respect, inquired about the princess's well-being, then added in an even voice that the emperor himself would soon arrive to see her. These words seared Rudis's consciousness as she could not understand what had caused such a sudden change. The girl's name was Lady Ivana, and she had once mockingly called the princess a pathetic wretchedness, not even worthy of pity, casting mocking glances at her with undisguised contempt, because in the entire palace there was no creature that she and her friends despised more. Being cruel and merciless, they took particular pleasure in humiliating the weak girl deliberately, locking her in a dark closet, forcing her to sit there in fear for long hours, and then laughing, handing her dried-out moldy bread through a crack, claiming that even such food was too much for her. Rudis looked anxiously from one girl to the other, remembering their cruelty, feeling how fear paralyzed her body, not allowing her to breathe, because she could not believe that these evil friends of her sister had suddenly changed, and if they were plotting something again, then what was really hidden behind their feigned humility? Feeling an icy uneasiness spreading within her, the princess, overcome with panic, screamed so loudly that her own voice echoed in the richly decorated room, and unable to bear their presence any longer, she ordered them to leave, wanting to see only empty space before her. Ivana, overcome by a storm of rage from the words she heard, clenched her fists so hard that her knuckles turned white and glared at Rudis with a look full of indignation and anger, but no matter how much she wanted to answer, she could not utter a single word stuck in her throat. With a slight but forced smile, the noblewoman said that she would leave the room, trying to maintain her dignity, and politely, albeit with a bit of pretense, apologized for her insolence in the conversation, allowing herself to say too much to her interlocutor. Rudis, hearing these words, was shocked to the depths of her soul, because she could not even imagine that this arrogant villainess, whose arrogance was always overflowing, would actually decide to do such a thing and apologize to her, which seemed to her something impossible. So without thinking twice, she looked closely at the aristocrat dressed in an elegant blue dress, and with a hint of hidden irritation, asked what she was trying to achieve by pretending to be a friendly interlocutor when this was clearly not the case. Ivana, without hiding her mockery, replied with a lazy grin that this was exactly how a princess who grew up among them, strange and alien, envious of her sister, named Selina, who was always the focus of everyone's attention and admiration, should have behaved. Indeed, Rudis often observed how her father warmly showered his other daughter with his love, care, and tenderness, as if she were the only light in his life, while he stubbornly ignored Rudis herself, as if she did not exist for him at all. Looking down and painfully biting her lip, the lady suddenly realized with frightening clarity that she no longer wanted to see her family, that there was no longer a drop of affection left in her heart, but only a caustic hatred that was eating away at her soul from within. Although the blood of the emperor himself flowed through her veins, granting her an indisputable right to the throne, fate, like a mocking puppeteer, decreed otherwise. She was never destined to take a place next to him, to become part of the brilliant elite to gain recognition. Ivana could not calm down, and without hiding her caustic mockery, continued to mock the princess with feigned concern, advising her to cast aside her sorrows, because then, according to her, everyone would certainly take care of her, although there was sarcasm in every word. But something inside Rudy's changed, and instead of the girl trembling with humiliation, another being filled with determination appeared at that moment, and straightening up, she ordered everyone to leave her room immediately in a firm, commanding voice that did not tolerate objections. Ivana froze in amazement, her eyes widened in bewilderment, and her lips parted in silent surprise, because this quiet mouse, whom she was used to despising and humiliating, suddenly dared not only to speak to her as an equal, but also to declare something insolent. Compared to the horror and sinister monster that the young noblewoman encountered during the summoning ceremony, all the conversations with the aristocrats, who felt nothing but contempt for her, seemed to her nothing more than naive, childish pranks, not even worth her attention. That is why Rudy's, not intending to give in to other people's demands, insisted with particular stubbornness on her own, assuring that she needed to be completely alone in order to collect her thoughts and find at least a drop of peace in this world full of hostility and hatred. But suddenly, one of the noble ladies, unable to tolerate such behavior, screamed loudly, declaring that the princess could not, under any circumstances, allow herself such disrespectful behavior, after which, without thinking, she grabbed her hand, intending to hold her back. However, the beauty, without even thinking sharply, pulled her hand away, instantly freeing herself from the stranger's grip, and anger, like a raging flame, surged in her soul, because this was not the first insolence she had encountered that day. The girl, looking at Rudis with alarm, tried to explain that if she drove them away without showing mercy, then cruel punishment would inevitably fall on their heads, and they would face painful punishments that they would no longer be able to avoid. A heavy silence hung in the room, filling the air with tension, as the girls stood before the princess, who sat on the luxurious bed, maintaining an impassive expression, but at the same time looking at them intently, waiting for them to finally speak. The beauty herself froze in silent shock, her thoughts rushing chaotically, trying to understand who could dare to punish noble ladies, and most importantly, for what purpose such a harsh order was given, which seemed to her both cruel and extremely strange. The only person who had enough power to make such a decision could only be her father, the majestic emperor, whose word in this palace was an indisputable law, and no one dared to question it. But suddenly, a strange voice was heard behind the massive closed doors, sharply attracting Rudis's attention, because someone was shouting something clearly forbidding the uninvited guest to enter the young lady's chambers, as if trying to prevent something unwanted. Suddenly, the door swung open with a dull thud, and a person resolutely entered the room, a tall lady in a scarlet dress, smoothly but confidently walking towards the aristocrats, and the princess herself, not hiding her rage and indignation. It was Selina herself, angry as the devil himself, with flushed cheeks, a wild, almost insane look in her eyes, and her hands clenched into fists, shaking with anger, betraying the storm of emotions raging within her that she could no longer contain. She shouted out a question loudly, demanding an explanation, her voice shaking with rage, her mouth hanging open, as if she couldn't breathe from the indignation that was overwhelming her, while she glared angrily at the people standing in front of her. Pointing her finger sharply at Rudis, the noblewoman demanded at the top of her voice to explain how her unworthy sister dared to be in her chambers, sit on her bed, and why everyone present bowed their heads in humiliation before this worthless loser, becoming even more furious that none of the ladies present even attempted to carry out her order and leave the room. Selina, seething with indignation, firmly decided to take everything into her own hands because she was not going to tolerate this blatant disgrace. Without wasting a second to think, Selina threw her hand forward with furious determination, roughly grabbed her sister by the hem of her dress sleeve, and yanking her with all her might, tried to pull her out of bed completely without thinking about the consequences of her actions. With a gloomy expression on her face, behind which a thick darkness seemed to swirl, Selina ordered her relative to leave the room immediately in a cold, peremptory tone, her fingers tightly clenching the fabric of the dress, leaving Rudy's no chance to resist. However, the girl only looked detachedly at the floor, showing neither fear nor indignation, as if her soul had long since resigned itself to its fate, and any attempts to fight seemed pointless, because fear of her sister had long since ceased to rule her heart. Selina froze, shocked to the core, when she received no reaction to her threats. No fear, no pleading, not even an irritated look, only a cold, almost lifeless indifference that made her insides boil. She smiled nervously, but her face still showed confusion, her frown expressed growing irritation, and her voice, low and hard, broke into a displeased question. Did Rudis really dare to ignore her? Anger, hatred, and unbridled rage distorted the beautiful features of her face. Her teeth were clenched in anger, the veins on her temples were bulging, and her eyes blazed with real fury, ready to burst out at any second. And at that very moment, suddenly flushed with rage, the noblewoman swung her hand, intending to hit her rebellious relative, wanting to teach her a lesson for her insolence and for daring to contradict her, without showing either fear or submission. But before her palm could reach its target, Ivana quickly intercepted the princess's hand, squeezing her wrist tightly, preventing her from striking, and thus preventing a reckless act that could not only worsen the situation, but also incur the wrath of their father. Selina froze in utter confusion, her body trembling, her eyes darting around in search of an answer, but she couldn't understand why her best friend had suddenly sided with Rudy's, when they had previously mocked her together without a shred of compassion. The sacrificial ceremony that took place only 3 days ago apparently did not succeed, if the gloomy and depressed expression on the face of the high priest, as well as the deep thoughtfulness that froze in the eyes of the emperor himself, are to be believed. Selina, saddened and depressed by the fact that her own father suddenly began to avoid and ignore her, desperately tried to talk to Prince Arctus, hoping for support, but he did not even deign to meet with her, instead, sending a servant to convey his refusal to her. But the hardest blow for the girl was something else. On that very day, when she was strolling carefree, enjoying a moment of solitude, she was suddenly interrupted, forced to stop. Irritated by such a rude intrusion into her thoughts, she turned around abruptly, the maid respectfully bowing her head, before the princess explained in a quiet but confident voice that after a full recovery, the emperor had made a final decision. Sister Selina should return to the palace and live with them again as before, without any objections. Selina, suddenly overcome with indignation, exclaimed with genuine fury that this could not be true, that there was clearly some monstrous mistake behind what had happened, or worse, some absurd, senseless nonsense that she refused to believe. Overwhelmed with indignation and misunderstanding, she firmly decided that the only way to understand what was happening was to personally meet her father and demand an explanation from him as to why he suddenly changed his mind and decided to bring her sister back to their home. Unable to contain her anger, the lady behaved defiantly and insolently towards her parent, uttering harsh, almost angry words, accusing him of obviously not being aware of his own actions and not realizing what his unexpected decision could lead to. And now, Ivana, instead of standing next to her and smiling at Rudis as before, suddenly changed and began to restrain her from rash actions, which only further fueled the feeling of betrayal and bitterness in the princess's soul. Selina, unable to contain her emotions, burst into tears, right in front of everyone, looking at Ivana, with eyes full of tears and anger. Her voice trembled with resentment, and a blush of rage flashed on her cheeks when she shouted how she even dared to treat her like that, because they were friends. Rudis only chuckled, watching this scene with slight surprise, not understanding why her sister was so shocked by her friend's betrayal, because she herself had long been accustomed to the rudeness and injustice of those around her, taking it for granted. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, Princess Selina, unable to contain her emotions any longer, fell straight to the floor and let out a piercing scream, causing everyone around to freeze in shock, because no one expected such abrupt and childishly capricious behavior from her. Through sobs and screams, breathing heavily from anger and resentment, Selina cried out in despair that she would definitely tell her father everything, and then he would definitely punish them all for their cruelty and injustice and unacceptable treatment of her, a princess of royal blood. Suddenly, the heavy doors swung open with a resounding echo, and the ladies sitting in the hall began to whisper hastily among themselves when a servant solemnly announced that the emperor himself had arrived, whose sudden appearance caused a slight excitement among those present. All the noble ladies, observing court etiquette, bowed gracefully before the ruler as soon as he crossed the threshold, and even the princesses, noticing their father, hastened to pay attention to him, feeling that his presence carried something alarming and important. Barthold stood on the threshold, dressed in dark robes. His face was gloomy and sullen, and from his figure emanated a heavy, almost tangible aura of discontent, in which one could sense the severity of a ruler and the anger of a man who had come here with a specific purpose. Rudis, unlike the others, did not bow her head before her parent, but on the contrary, straightened up, and without looking away, boldly met his stern eyes, because she had already made a firm decision for herself, never again to allow anyone to treat her like a weak-willed shadow. When Selina, with a broken voice, began to complain to her father that everyone around her was offending her, humiliating her, and completely disrespecting her, the emperor, instead of comforting his daughter, rudely interrupted her sharply, asking when she would finally stop behaving like a spoiled child. The lady stood there in confusion, her lips trembling in surprise, and a shadow of incomprehension flickered in her eyes as she desperately asked why her father had suddenly become so cold and why he was speaking to her in such an indifferent tone, which had never been heard in his voice before. The man didn't show the slightest pity, didn't stop even for a moment, just walked past as if she was nothing to him, and then he barked, demanding that his daughter immediately shut up, stop irritating him, and not dare to act up in front of him. Selina, as if stunned by a blow, froze in place, unable to believe what was happening, because her father, always kind and patient, had never spoken to her so rudely before, and this abrupt change made her eyes sting, and a lump of resentment rose in her throat. Covering his face with his hand to hide his fatigue and tension, Barthold sighed after a short pause, and softening his voice, reluctantly apologized for his harshness, quietly explaining that now was not the best time for her hysterics, because his mind was occupied with much more important things. After this, The emperor, without wasting time on unnecessary conversations, walked with a firm and decisive step towards his second daughter, who was sitting silently on the edge of the bed, looking fragile and lost, but still trying not to betray the fear that had gripped her. Without a single emotion on his face, in a cold and even voice, he said that apparently Rudis had finally come to her senses. His tone was dispassionate, detached. There was no joy or excitement in it, as if her awakening was just a long-awaited fact. The noblewoman herself, feeling her heart squeeze painfully in her chest, sat with her gaze lowered, not daring to utter a word, because her lips were trembling treacherously, and her voice, if she tried to speak, would certainly break, revealing how much she was afraid. She remembered the cruel words that had once escaped her father's lips, sounding cold and merciless, like a sharp blade piercing the very heart, because then he told her, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was a non-entity, existing only by absurd accident, having neither meaning nor value. In a stern, commanding voice that brooked no argument, Bartold ordered his daughter to immediately get out of bed and follow him, his tone dry and detached, as if he were speaking not to a blood relative, but to an ordinary servant obliged to obey without unnecessary questions. However, the girl did not move, continuing to sit in place and look straight at her father with the same silent firm, and what was especially bold, condemning look, in which there was no fear, but only an unshakable determination not to submit to his will anymore. The emperor, accustomed to unquestioning obedience, momentarily lost his composure, shocked that his daughter had dared to disobey, and recoiling in involuntary horror, suddenly realized that before him was no longer a helpless girl, but something far more frightening. The beauty's violet eyes were dark, ominous, and deep, not reflecting a single spark of emotion, but only a bottomless, frightening darkness that seemed capable of piercing anyone who dared to look into its abyss. This icy cold emanating from her very being was reminiscent of the eerie breath of an abandoned cursed temple standing in the midst of darkness and silence, where the walls hold the whispers of a forgotten past, and the air is saturated with an ancient, inexplicable fear. But the man did not allow himself to succumb to this strange feeling, quickly suppressing the doubt that flared up within him, and firmly convincing himself that in front of him sat only a worthless cripple, a mudblood whose existence was just a pathetic misunderstanding not worth his worries. That is why Bartold, without giving in to weakness, repeated his order with renewed fury. But this time, he did not simply say it, but broke into a shout, demanding that his daughter immediately get out of bed and follow him, submitting to his will, as befits those who are weaker. The man stood motionless, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for the princess to show submission, obey his command, and get out of bed. But contrary to his expectations, she continued to remain silent, in no hurry to answer or even show any intention of fulfilling her father's will. Rudis remained motionless, her face impassive, as if carved from marble, but deep within her violet eyes lay a steadfastness, cold and hard as frozen ice, and only after several agonizingly long seconds did she finally look up. After that, looking up, she quietly but firmly asked why she should do this. Why follow her father if she had neither the desire nor the reason to submit to his will? There was no fear in her voice, only a calm, icy determination. By asking this question, she dared to challenge her parent, breaking the established rules, according to which his word should be the unquestionable truth for her. But despite this, she did not look away or flinch. After a short pause, Rudis repeated her question, but now there was even more firmness in her voice, and clenching her hands into fists, she added that she was not going to go if her father had decided to sacrifice her again, if for him her life was again just a bargaining chip. Consumed with rage, Bartold raised his hand sharply, intending to hit his daughter for her insolence, for her disobedience, for that cold, defiant look, but at the last moment he froze, realizing that there were other nobles in the room closely watching his every move. If he allowed himself to give in to his anger and raise his hand against the princess in front of witnesses, it would inevitably cast a shadow on his reputation, portraying him not as a just ruler, but as a man unable to control his own emotions, and so he slowly lowered his hand. Containing his rage, the man coldly repeated his order, this time putting even more steely superiority into his voice, demanding that the princess immediately obey, stop her senseless resistance, and follow him, because his patience was coming to an end. Rudy slowly raised her eyes, looking up at her parent, and suddenly it seemed to hit her with the realization of how foolish she had been before. because it took her so long to see his true nature rotten from the inside, devoid of love. Finally, the princess silently rose from her bed, trying not to show the trembling in her fingers, and slowly began to put on her slippers, realizing that further resistance would bring her nothing but even greater wrath from the emperor, which meant it was better not to risk provoking him now. The maid, seeing her mistress stagger, immediately rushed forward to support her, but Rudis, without even looking at her, calmly replied that there was no need for that, since she was completely fine, even if this was far from the truth. The long corridor of the palace, covered with expensive carpets, with richly decorated walls and gilded carved doors, stretched out before them, reminding them of the grandeur of the empire. But in the eyes of Rudis, it seemed only a cold prison with no exit. The emperor, without turning around, swung open the heavy doors and confidently stepped forward, his quick, firm steps echoing in the silence, and the princess, barely clenching her fists, followed him, feeling how with each step her heart squeezed with an anxious premonition. Rudis, obediently following her father, suddenly froze for a moment, surprised to notice that in the room they were heading to, there was already a person whose presence made her heart beat a little faster, filling her mind with disturbing thoughts about the reason for this sudden visit. A young man was sitting in one of the chairs, and as soon as Rudis had time to get a good look at him, he immediately jumped up, and a welcoming, even too joyful smile appeared on his face, which for some reason seemed out of place to her, as if there was something hidden behind it that she could not yet understand. It was none other than the high priest named Bennett, a man whose role in the empire was no less important than that of the emperor himself, and before the princess could even comprehend what this strange visit was leading to, he suddenly said that he was glad to see her. The emperor, without showing any emotion, sat down on one of the sofas. Rudis took her place, and opposite them sat the priest, and silence hung in the air, foreshadowing a long, difficult conversation in which, as she felt, she was about to hear something that would change her life forever. As soon as the emperor gave the order, the servants, not daring to hesitate, hastily left the hall, and after them, the heavy door slammed behind them, with a dull echo finally separating the room from the rest of the palace, locking inside a tense, almost tangible silence. As soon as the last steps had died away, Bartold's expression changed abruptly. The ostentatious restraint evaporated, and he demanded an answer from the priest as to whether they really needed Rudis in this ritual and whether there really was no other way out. The emperor clenched his fists angrily, his voice growing louder and harsher, demanding a clear answer as to whether Bennett was sure that the one who appeared during the ritual was truly the supreme god and not just a play of shadows born of blind faith and fears. When the priest, after much deliberation, finally gave his blessing, Bartold, overcome by a storm of emotion, sprang up from his seat, his voice trembling with rage and disbelief as he declared that this could not be, and then, with despair in his eyes, pointed to his unloved daughter. After this, he looked away, thought for a moment, and added with cold determination that, among other things, the lady remained completely unharmed, which only increased his suspicions and forced him to look for a hidden meaning in what was happening that no one could yet understand. The priest, looking down and experiencing an internal conflict, he admitted that even earlier doubts had arisen in his heart, and he was not entirely sure whether the deity that appeared to him was true, since his actions and words did not always correspond to what was predicted in the sacred texts. The man's hand gripped the armrest of the massive throne, tightly betraying the tension within him, while the ruler of the great empire frowned with irritation, his thoughts racing between anger and the need to maintain composure. The priest, clearly uncomfortable under the emperor's heavy gaze, carefully noted that higher powers do not always obey the orders of those who call upon them, since there is an unbridgeable gap between a mortal's request and a command that must be carried out. The emperor, hearing such insolent words, frowned sharply, and his face was distorted with rage, after which he roared angrily, demanding that the priest immediately shut up, for he no longer wished to hear a word that could sow new doubts in his soul. The lady remained immersed in silence, only occasionally casting cautious glances, while her father, on the contrary, sat in his chair with obvious displeasure, tensely tapping his fingers on the armrest, as if holding back emotions that threatened to burst out at any second. Rudis couldn't help but notice the absurdity and ridiculousness of the situation she found herself in, as if fate had decided to play a cruel joke on her, driving her into a corner where any decision threatened to turn into suffering for her. When the man, with cold determination, suggested performing the ritual again, assuring her that this was the only possible way. The lady could not restrain herself and resolutely objected, declaring that she did not want to become a victim again, and without flinching, she called her own father a real tyrant. Gathering all her resolve, Rudy's firmly declared that she would never again, under any circumstances, become a victim, no matter what anyone tried to order her to do, and she would rather meet her fate than allow herself to submit to someone else's will again. Enraged by his daughter's refusal, the ruler of the empire jumped from his seat, his voice soaring to the ceiling, as he, without holding back his anger, called her ungrateful, and then, narrowing his eyes coldly, declared that if she did not agree voluntarily, she would be punished with a whip. Rudy's did not back down, and stubbornly continued to insist on her own, declaring that Selena was more suitable for the role of the victim because her blood was pure, which meant that the ritual would have a much better chance of success than if she had been chosen, and she could not ignore this fact. Suddenly, a sharp bang shook the air in the room as the father quickly raised his hand and slapped his daughter hard across the face, silencing her, his gaze blazing with fury and his voice full of contempt as he ordered her to never speak such nonsense again. The emperor's face remained dark and his lips twisted with malice as he coldly declared that his daughter was a terrible egoist for whom her own life meant more than the fate of the entire family, and that this was the most shameful betrayal. Rudis looked at him with an impassive expression and could not understand what she should be grateful to him for. Was it really for the years of ridicule, constant humiliation, and cruel bullying that he showered her with, since childhood, making her feel insignificant? The high priest stood to the side, his hands trembling slightly, and a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He watched in horror as the emperor raised his hand against his daughter again and again, but he could not dare stop him, because he knew that he would pay for it with his life. Rudis was breathing heavily. Her chest was tight with pain. A scarlet drop of blood was running down her lips. Her eyes were clouded with weakness, but what she felt most was not the physical pain, but the fear and bitterness from the realization that she would never be someone her father could love. The man did not calm down, and overcome with rage, continued to shout, demanding to know why his daughter dared to go against his will, why she was resisting so stubbornly, and only complicating what could have been resolved long ago if she had simply submitted as befits her. The noblewoman, sitting up with difficulty, only indifferently, wiped the blood running down her lips and looked coldly at her father, realizing how stupid she had been before wanting to find his love, because only now she clearly saw what a monster he had always been. A shudder ran through the man's body, even though he didn't want to admit it, but he was overcome with fear because in front of him sat a beaten girl who should have been sobbing and begging for mercy, but instead she remained frighteningly calm, as if everything that was happening did not matter to her. Everything seemed to be going wrong. People were following their own paths, not those prepared for them by the master. Even the foolish mother of Rudy's at one time refused to obey and turned away from the path, which for him became another betrayal. In a rage, the man roughly grabbed his daughter by the hair, forcing her to look him straight in the eyes. But even at that moment, she continued to stubbornly resist, firmly refusing to accept his plans and follow the cruel plan that he considered the only correct one. But suddenly, the heavy atmosphere of the room was cut by the sound of footsteps, and the next moment, the door opened. Another man appeared on the threshold, whose voice, full of surprise and slight displeasure, rang out in the silence when he inquired what was causing such a noise here. In the doorway stood a tall, frighteningly handsome man with a wild, almost animal-like gaze. His golden eyes with narrow pupils glowed like two hot coals, and his long black hair fell in heavy strands onto his shoulders. Those present in the room felt a chill run through their bodies. Tension thickened in the air, and even the emperor himself, who had previously known no fear, recoiled instantly, stopping torturing his daughter, his face turning pale, and his gaze darted towards the guest. The stranger's yellow eyes blazed rage lurking in their depths, but he remained sullen and silent, as if he were holding back the storm that raged within him, and his silent presence exerted far more pressure than any threats or angry cries. The nobles, realizing who stood before them, quickly bowed their heads in reverence, for before them appeared the deity himself, whose arrival had been awaited with trepidation and fear, but none of them could predict what kind of wrath he would bring. Rudis looked up in amazement, as even her domineering, unyielding father, who always held his head high, suddenly bowed his head before the stranger, casting wary glances at him, as if trying to comprehend who this man was that could inspire fear in the emperor himself. The young man, without giving anyone an extra glance, walked past the priest, with a confident but unhurried gait, heading straight for the ruler, his yellow eyes flickering in the semi-darkness of the room, exuding a certain dangerous, almost predatory power that made one want to step back. However, without stopping near the emperor, he silently continued on his way, past him, and sat down next to the princess, who was sitting on the cold stone floor, wounded, exhausted, with a dim look that still did not lose its pride. Beaten, exhausted, and overcome with fear, the noblewoman slowly raised her head with trembling eyes, studying the stranger from bottom to top, her disheveled hair falling in disarray over her face, and her dirty, blood-stained dress reminded her of her recent suffering. Her violet eyes, wide open with amazement, trembled in the semi-darkness, reflecting a mixture of horror, incomprehension, and faint hope. She did not know what to expect from this mysterious man, whose gaze glowed with a strange golden light. Having made sure that this girl was the princess, the stranger calmly dropped to one knee in front of her. His movements were unhurried, but they conveyed an undeniable confidence, as if he had no doubt in his right to be near her. Rudy's parted her lips in confusion, unable to hide her surprise, and the next moment, her face flushed slightly. Completely unexpectedly for herself, she felt warmth and a strange calm inside, as if next to this man, the danger tormenting her heart had retreated. When asked who he was, the young man did not give a direct answer, but only with a slight grin asked a counter-question in which a mocking playfulness was evident. Did the lady herself, having already come face to face with him, not understand who he really was? Then, after briefly holding his attentive gaze on her, he noticed her confusion, allowed himself a slight smile, and as if amused by her confusion, calmly suggested that she call him Lavaine, as if this name was supposed to dispel all her doubts. The noblewoman looked at this mysterious man in complete confusion, trying to understand the meaning of his words and catch at least something familiar in his face, but no matter how hard she looked, she could not understand who he was and why he was speaking to her with such confidence. Her wide, bewildered violet eyes reflected the stranger's appearance, his black hair and gaze burning with a yellow fire, but no matter how much she tried to delve into her memory stubbornly remained empty, giving no answers. Lavaine, closing his eyes, calmly reminded her that their meeting had happened much earlier than she could remember, because he was the very creature that had languished for many years in captivity, deep underground, in a crypt hidden from the eyes of mortals. The noblewoman froze in shock, her body motionless, and genuine horror splashed in her wide-open eyes, while scarlet blood trickled down her broken skin, a cold touch reminding her of her recent suffering, but the fear that gripped her now was much deeper. The young man turned out to be the same monster she had encountered in the pitch-black darkness when his body was hidden by the darkness, and the only thing that betrayed his presence were two huge, glowing, predatory eyes, warily watching her from the depths of the night. Long before all living things appeared before the first dawn and the first words of mankind, this ancient deity existed in the darkness, silent, all-consuming, unchanging, as if time itself had no power over it. Once they were called gods, worshipped, sacrificed, begged for favor, but in reality, these creatures were demons, ancient and insatiable, whose true desire was the flesh of others, the blood of others, and the subjugation of the weak. The young man lazily waved his hand to the side, as if brushing off something invisible, and with a slight mockery asked the lady if everything that had happened to her seemed strange, unbearably alien to her understanding, as if reality itself had begun to distort. And then he indifferently added that if there was anything that did not suit her, if there was indignation or fear in her heart, then the girl should say so directly, because such silence would not save her from what had already happened. Rudy's froze in mute horror. Her body seemed to have turned to stone. Her lips did not tremble, and the fear that gripped her throat did not allow her to make a sound, and all she could do was silently stare with wide eyes, fearing that any wrong word could be a fatal mistake for her. A man's scarred hand tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, with unexpected tenderness, gently sliding it down her cheek, as if a gesture of care could erase the traces of pain and fatigue left by her own father's cruelty. Lavaine, whose expression remained calm, tried to calm his interlocutor gently, saying that everything was fine, that her fears were in vain, and that he would help her get up, because watching her get hurt and suffer was unbearable for him. The woman's hands trembled, clenching into fists from bewilderment and internal protest, because she could not understand why the creature that was called a monster suddenly showed such kindness, why this monster spoke to her as if she did not need to be afraid. Waiting for her decision, the young man leaned forward slightly, extending his hand with unwavering calm, his amber eyes never leaving her face, and in that look there was a promise. He would not retreat, would not turn away, would not leave until she accepted his help. Levane noticed that the lady stubbornly refused to accept his help, and not wanting to insist with a slight smile, offered her another way out, promising to deal with her offenders in the way she herself wished, because now she had a chance to change her fate. Rudy silently raised her head, her gaze flickering when she heard that she was the reason this mysterious man was here, and the thought that everything that happened was not an accident made her heart skip a beat. Suddenly, Levane, without losing his predatory grace, carefully leaned towards her and gently cupped her cheeks with his palms. His touch was warm, filled with something inexplicable, and in this gesture one could read not only support, but also a strange, inexplicable affection. The people in the room froze in complete shock, unable to take their eyes off the princess, who suddenly began to glow softly, with a pinkish radiance, and the girl herself felt something inexplicable awaken within her body, filling her with a warmth she had never known before. As if responding to her change, pink magical patterns also began to spread across Levain's body, shimmering on his skin, and this instant response of ancient power changed the entire atmosphere in the hall, causing those present to hold their breath. Levain, with a slight smile, uttered the magic words of promise filled with sincerity, and presented the lady with proof of his devotion, which caused her genuine surprise, because she never thought that someone was capable of linking their fate with her life. With a gentle sadness in his voice, the young man told her that his existence in this world was not an accident. It was inextricably linked only with her alone, and if not for her, he would have remained in oblivion, buried in the darkness, where his true nature should have remained forever. Hiding a shadow of sadness in his amber eyes, Levane lowered his gaze and admitted with quiet frankness that if something happened to her, or the magical seal that bound them disappeared, he too would be erased from the world, returning to the primordial chaos where his existence would lose all meaning. The young man warmly called Rudius his savior, and with a slight reproach asked if after all that had been said, she still could not trust him, since their destinies were now more intertwined than even the ancient prophecies could have imagined. Rudius, her fingers trembling, slowly raised her hand and gently squeezed Levaine's palm, which rested on her cheek, this simple gesture showing that she finally accepted his words and was ready to entrust him with her faith, her destiny, and perhaps something more. Levane, with a warm smile and unwavering confidence in his gaze, gently lifted the princess from the cold floor, allowing her to lean on him, and in this simple but meaningful gesture, there was a promise. From now on, as long as he was near, she would no longer be alone and would never fall. The lady, rising from the cold stone floor, suddenly realized with genuine amazement that the wound that had recently tormented her flesh with burning pain had healed itself, and now she could stand firmly as if she had never been subjected to either wound or torment. Their conversation was interrupted suddenly and without warning, the imperious and impatient voice of the emperor himself, sounding with a hint of barely restrained irritation, addressed Monsieur Levane, demanding immediate attention and not tolerating a second of delay. When the ruler, with pride and cold dignity, declared that he had accomplished everything he had intended, the young man, in whose veins flowed divine power, flared up with righteous anger, and a fiery light flared up in his eyes, casting a frightening golden glow. An icy chill ran down Bartold's spine, causing him to instinctively retreat, as if the darkness enveloping the figure before him had acquired a will of its own and was about to engulf him, depriving him of the opportunity to even breathe in the oppressive heavy air. Realizing the hopelessness of his situation, the ruler of the great empire, clenching his fists and taking a deep breath, bowed respectfully, almost submissively, before the powerful lord named Levane, humbly asking him to fulfill everything that was required of him. When the young man agreed to fulfill the request, Bartold at first felt relief, his heart trembled with joy, but this brief moment of happiness melted away. At the same moment, as soon as he heard that behind all this, there was one single but extremely weighty condition. Levane, maintaining an icy expression on his face that did not reflect a shadow of emotion, said without a shadow of a doubt that he was demanding the most important thing from the emperor, to renounce all his powers and unconditionally transfer power over the empire to him. Bartold froze, as if a bolt from the blue had pierced his consciousness, and frowning in confusion, he forced out a question with difficulty, trying to understand what exactly the ancient god meant, what secret plans were hidden behind his demand. Lavaine sighed heavily, as if tired of endless human misunderstanding, then slowly turned away, muttering under his breath, with a hint of mocking contempt, that humans had been using rituals for thousands of years, but still remained blind to their true nature, remaining fools. Even in that tense moment, standing before the powerful god, Bartold continued to skillfully pretend, playing the role of a caring father, repeating that he was doing everything for his daughter, but his false words remained empty. They could not hide the truth. The noblewoman stood there, barely containing the rage raging within her. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of malice mixed with genuine horror, as if the collision with something insurmountable had simultaneously evoked in her fear and implacable hatred. The ruler of the empire, as if unafraid, pointed his finger with complete confidence at the young man who was not just a man, but the supreme god, and without flinching, said that he was obliged to obey him to carry out his every word, as befits someone of lower rank. Lavaine's face darkened, a dark shadow falling across his features, as if the darkness itself responded to his indignation. He did not like at all that a mortal dared to tell him how to act, trying to subdue someone whose power knew no bounds. The man felt a shudder run through his body. He tried his best to suppress his fear, convincing himself that the demon he himself had summoned could not harm him. But even this thought did not save him from the paralyzing horror. Suddenly, the cunning Bartold grabbed his head, fell to his knees, and screamed in unbearable pain. It seemed like his skull was about to shatter into pieces, and dark magic began to swirl around him, filling the air with thick, oppressive streams of power. Indifferently, with just the hint of contempt in his voice, the handsome Lavaine called the ruler of the empire a fool and a worthless creature, unworthy of even attempting to command, one whose will extended far beyond mortal comprehension. Having no other choice, the vile Bartold sank to his knees again, his shoulders drooping and his head bowed before the higher powers, in a gesture of submission, emphasizing his complete helplessness before the one who cannot be disobeyed. Following him as if guided by an unknown force, the high priest slowly sank down onto the cold stone floor. His arrival was not accidental. In his heart lived a desperate prayer, addressed to the great deity whose boundless power could change the course of history. The priest, leaving his pride behind with trembling hands and a mournful expression on his face, fell prostrate before the noble lords, begging them to appeal to a higher power for their lands, were plunging into chaos, and the people, losing all hope, were perishing from hunger, war, and inevitable oblivion. In their kingdom, ravaged by a merciless war and engulfed in all-consuming chaos, thousands of people died every day. Fear dominated the mind, hunger tormented the body, and death collected its harvest, leaving behind only the shadows of the living who had lost hope. And so now the priest, filled with despair, offered up prayers to the young master, the god behind whom stood the princess, whose fate seemed already predetermined, as well as the fate of the entire kingdom, balancing on the brink of destruction. But these words did not make the slightest impression on the young man, and therefore, with a cold detachment in his gaze, he only reminded him that he had neither interest nor desire to interfere in their destinies, because their misfortunes had neither meaning nor significance for him. Rudis wondered what horror would befall their lands. If the deity truly refused to help, what destruction would follow this refusal, and how many people were destined to perish in the fire of chaos if the higher power turned its back on them. At that very moment, a strange realization dawned on her. By some inexplicable miracle, she had remained alive after the bloody ritual. Her body had not crumbled to dust, and the magical seal that had shimmered on the floor had somehow not taken her soul. The priest, with drooping shoulders and a heavy heart, acknowledged the obvious. God did not want to help them, and if this was really so, then what would happen to them all now? What awaited the kingdom, left to its fate without divine intercession? Lavaine, not hiding his mockery, loudly declared that since Rudis had been sacrificed to this ritual, its power, contrary to the expectations of others, now belonged to her, and not to those who tried to manipulate fate. The priest was shocked to the depths of his soul by the words he heard. His gaze slowly slid towards the emperor in an attempt to find in his face at least a glimmer of understanding or awareness of what was happening, but he came across only a reflection of confusion and anger. The ruler, who was still kneeling, could not believe his ears. His mind refused to accept reality, and so he angrily called the youth's words absurd nonsense, refusing to accept that the fate of the kingdom now depended on his own daughter. And only now did it dawn on the man that if he truly wanted to save his country from destruction, if he longed for mercy for himself and his people, then he had no choice but to bow before the one he despised and humbly ask her for help. After several agonizing moments, filled with oppressive silence, Bartold, unable to suppress his pride, left the room with a gloomy expression, his footsteps echoing in the cold space, leaving the princess alone with the young man. The priest, realizing that there was no other way out, with tears of relief in his eyes, but with a warm, sincere smile, decided to support the princess and heal her because it was she who was now to become the key to saving the kingdom. Under the god's watchful eye, he carefully took Rudis's delicate hand, trying to help her up. His touch was light but confident, as if the very air around them was permeated with an invisible force, protecting her from another fall and weakness. Casting a quick glance at the girl out of the corner of his eye, Levane noted that despite her apparent calm, it was worth remaining vigilant, because there was always someone who could do something reckless again, which would lead to even greater consequences. The noblewoman, slowly watching the god leave the hall involuntarily, lingered her gaze on the massive door, watching as it slowly closed behind him, leaving in the room only her, the priest, and the silence filled with the echo of the events that had taken place. The priest, busy healing the girl himself, did not fully understand what they should do now, but only one thing was obvious. After Mr. Levane left, the air in the room seemed to become cleaner, and breathing suddenly became easier, as if an invisible weight had fallen. When the treatment was completed, the saint, with a slight, friendly smile, offered to escort the lady back to her chambers, hoping that after all she had experienced, she needed at least a little peace and solitude to recover. The beauty frowned with displeasure, and crossing her arms, explained with obvious irritation that she absolutely did not want to return to the room assigned to her, because these were the chambers of her sister, with whom she had always had a strained and difficult relationship. All those noblewomen, who had previously knelt down begging for help, had only pretended to be kind, and now that the threat had passed, there was not a drop of sincerity left in their gazes, and their smiles were nothing more than masks, hiding indifference and lies. The graceful feminine fingers once relaxed, and graceful trembled with inner tension until they clenched into strong fists, as if reflecting the storm of emotions that was bursting to get out, and the priest, watching her closely, understood without words what heavy feelings were tearing at her soul. The princess, suddenly raising her head at the unexpected proposal to have dinner together, broke the silence, and narrowing her eyes, suggested that they go to the temple of God, instead clearly not wanting to waste time on idle conversations. The young man, feeling the burden of guilt that pressed on his heart, understood that he himself had once been part of the ritual that had brought her suffering, and therefore now, even though he was late, he wanted to atone for his mistake and at least try to make amends for his guilt. It was a real revelation for the lady to hear from the lips of the young man that even the emperor himself had no right to bring knights into the sacred halls of the temple without the permission of the deity, because before she had no idea how strict this law was. The priest, who had expected to see only hatred and indignation in her eyes, suddenly froze in amazement when he heard words of gratitude from the princess, because he was prepared for accusations, but not for her unexpected gratitude. But Rudis did not feel any anger or hold a grudge. On the contrary, she was genuinely glad that the man had found the strength to apologize for the pain he had caused her, and instead of reproach or coldness, a warm, light smile full of acceptance and understanding blossomed on her face. The princess's unexpected reaction almost brought tears to the young man's eyes, as he had expected anger or contempt, but instead, he encountered a kindness that seemed truly endless, too pure for a man who had endured so much suffering. The chief priest, surrounded by other adepts, stood at the entrance to the church and greeted the guests with due respect, his voice sounding even and solemn, as if the sacred monastery itself spoke through the lips of its servants. Rudis gratefully accepted the care and expressed her appreciation for being given a spacious, bright room to live in, and her smile, full of gratitude, looked so sincere that everyone around her felt a warm sense of peace. However, as soon as she was left alone, The lightness instantly gave way to fatigue, and sighing heavily, the girl fell exhausted onto the soft bed, finally allowing herself to relax after a long, anxiety-filled day. Closing her eyes, the young girl again heard the voice of that very God in her mind, reminding herself of his words, that his power now belonged to her, and the realization of this covered her with a wave of an unknown frightening premonition. The noblewoman no longer wished to be a puppet in the hands of her father, to walk in chains, following only his will, submitting without the right to vote, and at that moment a firm decision was born in her heart to break these invisible bonds once and for all. Suddenly, a servant's voice broke the silence, informing her that the emperor himself had arrived in the chambers, and hiding the alarm that had flared up under a mask of calm, Rudis restrainedly allowed him to enter, showing neither fear nor doubt. The figure of the man who stepped into her room seemed dark and terrifying, as if he brought the night itself with him, and his commanding presence was oppressive, while the princess maintained an unperturbed appearance, sitting on the bed and not looking away. The ruler's face was shrouded in darkness, as if the night itself was reflected in his features, and malice, tension, and a chilling coldness emanated from him, reminiscent of an evil omen, and his entire aura, filled with hidden rage, exuded an oppressive threat. But the lady had already made her final decision. From now on, she would not allow herself to show weakness, would not flinch under his heavy gaze, and would not be afraid of the one who had considered her all his life merely a tool to achieve his goals. And suddenly, breaking the usual order of things, the emperor spoke, but not imperiously, not coldly, but differently, for the first time in her entire life, addressing her not as a pawn, not as a subject, but calling her by that word that she had never heard from him, daughter. Earlier, the noblewoman's sister was in a dark room surrounded by the chaos of scattered books, and trembling from the surging emotions, she was quietly crying, burying her face in the bed, unable to contain the bitterness that was eating away at her heart. The ruler of the empire came in person to apologize to his daughter for her harshness and rudeness, for the scream that escaped before he had time to realize how much he hurt her. But can his words change anything now? The first attack occurred 3 years ago, when a crimson lightning bolt struck from the eastern lands, tearing the sky apart, illuminating the city with an ominous light, foreshadowing the disasters that followed it like someone's inexorable punishment. The might of the great empire, which had once seemed unshakable, began to rapidly fade. The crown lost its strength, and the power of the imperial family weakened with each passing day, holding on to its former greatness with trembling fingers. The man gritted his teeth in frustration, remembering how just recently he had been convinced that by sacrificing the worthless, as he considered Rudy's, he could return their lost power. But now that everything had changed, this thought only caused him anger and bitterness. Bartold, overcome with despair, made an oath to his beloved daughter that no matter the cost, he would not allow the country to disappear without a trace into the abyss of oblivion. He would fix everything, he would find a way to return to its former power, even if it meant making unimaginable sacrifices. Now the emperor sat opposite Rudy's, at a heavy oak table, and a tense, oppressive silence fell between them, which said more than any words, but neither of them was in a hurry to break it first. This time, the ruler did not raise his voice, did not shower his daughter with angry reproaches, but on the contrary, for the first time in her life, called her by this warm word, daughter, and calmly spoke about the fact that she now possessed the power that allowed her to control the very power of the deity. The princess frowned and then smiled sadly, fully aware that her father had simply changed his tactics, now trying not to intimidate her, but to win her favor, because just recently he had beaten her, despised her, and treated her like trash, and now he was suddenly trying to be gentle. The girl froze when the man, without hiding his calculations, said that if she remained on their side, if she was faithful to the family and the crown, then he would always treat her as kindly, as warmly, as he had previously spoken to her sister, reminding her of what she never had. Unable to bear the irony of the situation, the girl sitting at the table quietly laughed. Her laughter was bitter, but there was an undisguised mockery in it, as if she had only just now realized the absurdity of what was happening, and it was even funnier for her than it should have been. Then Bartold narrowed his eyes darkly, watching his daughter closely, and hoarsely asked what exactly she found so funny in his words, but there was not a drop of good nature in his voice, only cold irritation and hatred. Placing her hand on her chest, as if trying to calm the sudden surge of emotion, the beauty calmly but firmly explained that after everything that had happened, this man no longer had the right to be called her father, that he had lost it the very moment he betrayed her, and now she did not even want to see him in front of her. The ruler of the empire was clearly dissatisfied with this answer. A dark shadow of irritation crossed his face, his hands clenched into fists, and his jaw clenched so tightly that one could hear his teeth grinding, and at that moment it became clear that his anger was about to burst out. But Rudy's, oblivious to the growing tension, merely added indifferently that it was high time they stopped this pathetic farce because she was not going to play his games, and moreover, there was only one thing she really wanted to get. The emperor, watching his daughter tensely, who now seemed completely different to him, frighteningly unpredictable, felt a growing anxiety that gnawed at him from within, and hiding his irritation behind icy calm. After a long pause, he asked what she wanted. It could have been anything: a scattering of precious stones, dresses made of expensive fabrics, rustling like the wind, or perhaps an opportunity to take revenge on those who once looked down on her, with disdain, not recognizing her dignity and considering her only a shadow in this world. The ruler, clenching his teeth until they creaked, sighed heavily, not taking his intense gaze off the one he considered insignificant, and yet he could not help but wonder what this at first glance pathetic girl could want who dared to stand before him and demand the impossible. The noblewoman sitting opposite the ruler did not show the slightest excitement. She simply straightened her back and, sliding a penetrating gaze over him coldly, and clearly stated that her demands were unshakable, and there were only 3 of them, but each one would change this world. The man grinned coldly and cruelly, calling his daughter an unfortunate creature of darkness, a daring and reckless monster who dared to set conditions for the one whose will determined the fate of people to whom the empire itself belonged, whom even the gods did not dare to contradict. Rudius, without flinching, calmly asked her father to moderate the ardor that had flared up within him, and to humble his pride, for if he did not retreat from his arrogant position and did not curb the rage raging within him, he risked never receiving what he so longed for with all his being. There was no turning back now, no hesitation was possible, and all that was left was to step forward, following the faint, flickering light of hope that pierced the thick and merciless darkness that shrouded their future in a dark shroud. The lady held not just 1 but 2 trump cards, and all she had to do was decide how to play them in this tense battle of wits, in this game, without rules, where power over the empire and the fate of those caught up in this inevitable whirlwind of events were at stake. Initially, her wish was simple and irrevocable. She wanted Selena to be the next victim of the ritual rite, but now that the deity had already been summoned, and its will had imprinted the fates of mortals, there was no longer the slightest sense in this, and her plans changed. The second card that fell into her hands was far more dangerous, and slightly bowing her head, the princess asked her father with feigned thoughtfulness what the reaction of the church and all the clergy would be when they learned that he had treated her, his daughter, not as an heir. Her lips twitched in a cruel cold smile as she calmly, but with frightening confidence, added that ordinary citizens, upon learning of such a vile act by the ruler, might not only be outraged, but even rise up in rebellion and stage a coup. Bartold could no longer contain himself. He could not hide his rage, and his face twisted in anger. He cursed foully, defiling her name with insults full of hatred because his soul was burned by the realization that she, this pathetic girl, dared to threaten him. However, taking a deep breath, he forced himself to remain silent, clenching his fists until his fingers were white and squinting. He hoarsely asked what this noblewoman was ultimately trying to achieve, but even in this question, there was tension, because he was afraid to take a step that could once again provoke the wrath of the deity. With her head down and her gaze concealing the sadness, the beautiful girl sighed softly, making it clear that she did not crave gold power or support from the man who had once been called her father, because everything he could give now had no value for her. Looking at her reflection in the depths of a cup of cooling tea, Rudius calmly but firmly explained that from now on he was obliged to speak to her with due respect if he really intended to make a deal with her, because there was no longer room for humiliation in this world. Bartold finally realized that he would have to listen to his daughter, even if every phrase she said cut his pride like a blade, and trembling with suppressed anger, he forced out a tense question, demanding to know exactly what conditions she was going to present to him. But as soon as he heard the answer, his patience collapsed. The emperor jumped up from his seat, unable to hide his rage, because it was unthinkable to him that the lady dared to plan to use such great power given from above just to protect the empire and get rid of monsters. The second condition that escaped her scarlet lips was the desire to leave the confines of the palace forever, to go as far away as possible, to where the walls of this cold place could no longer fetter her freedom and remind her of the past that she intended to leave behind. Rudy's, looking her father straight in the eye, calmly explained that she intended to move to another duchy, one that did not intersect with the empire's territories, where her name would no longer be a heavy burden, where she could begin a new life free from the old chains. The third condition was the final step towards a complete break. She made it clear that she wanted to break free once and for all from the cage in which she had been kept for years. And with this decision came the realization it was time to leave, cutting off all ties that once connected her to this family. The Duchy of Arctis, to which she intended to go, stood as a bastion of justice and nobility, and its symbol was a sword shining with a pure blue light, personifying not only the courage of valiant warriors, but also the unshakable righteousness of the ruler himself. Dulio Arctis, the leader of this house, was renowned for his unwavering honor, his graceful yet deadly fighting style, and the fact that he fought in war not for power, but to protect his people, whose loyalty to him was unwavering. Rudis couldn't help but notice that a warm, trusting relationship had developed between Selena and the young man from the neighboring duchy, meaning there were no foreseeable reasons for conflict between their lands, which only strengthened her confidence in the correctness of her decision. Having finished putting forward her conditions, the beauty raised a calm but expectant gaze to her rude father, giving him the opportunity to realize that there was no turning back, and now it depended only on him what the next step would be in this silent chess game. The emperor merely looked at her silently, as if trying to find a weakness in her words, but his silence spoke louder than any speech, because he had no choice but to resign himself and accept everything she demanded. Soon it was deep night, and a thick darkness enveloped the world like a soft but impenetrable blanket, and high in the sky, among the rare cold stars, the moon shone brightly, flooding the silent streets, and the palace walls, frozen in anticipation of change, with silvery light. Rudy sat in the Kremlin by the window, her posture impeccably calm, her hands resting neatly on her skirt, as if even this tense conversation could not shake her composure, although deep down she felt fatigue rolling over her, pressing down like a heavy weight. Finally, Bartold, unable to find another way out, gritting his teeth, reluctantly agreed to all her conditions, and without deigning to say an extra word to his daughter, quickly left the chambers, leaving behind only the painful echo of his steps. The beauty tiredly closed her eyes, allowing herself to relax for a moment, because this entire oppressive, exhausting conversation had sucked the last of her strength out of her, making her feel the weight of every word that had been spoken that evening. But suddenly, her body began to tremble treacherously, as if something inside her had suddenly broken, rolling through every cell like an invisible wave, and overcome by a sudden weakness, she felt herself losing control of her own movements and staggering. The woman's body almost collapsed, plunging into unconsciousness, but at that very moment, strong male arms gently but confidently caught her, preventing her fragile silhouette from collapsing onto the floor, holding her in the chair, as if carefully protecting her from the inevitable fall. It was Lavaine who had come to the palace that night to see the noblewoman, whose name kept echoing in his thoughts, and now he stood over her, watching carefully, as the moonlight glided across her tired face, softening its features ever so slightly. Without thinking twice, he carefully bent down, lifted the exhausted princess into his arms, feeling her lightness as if she were woven from fragile shadows, and without wasting any time carried her away to where the chambers would finally give her the rest she so desperately needed. With particular tenderness, he laid her down on the spacious bed, surrounding her with soft scarlet pillows and cool silk sheets, allowing her exhausted body to drown in comfort, where fatigue would finally give way to long-awaited peace. His warm palm slid across her cheek, barely brushing away the stray strands of hair from her face, so that nothing would disturb her sleep, as if he wanted to preserve this moment of serenity, giving her the tenderness that she had perhaps been deprived of for so long. Leaning closer, he whispered under his breath that she truly deserved a rest, as she had put in a lot of effort today, and leaving behind only a light trail of warmth, his silhouette dissolved into the air, as if scattering in the glowing moon dust. The lady's fingers trembled slightly, As if in the depths of sleep, her consciousness had caught echoes of the young man's words, penetrating the veil of oblivion, causing her heart to clench anxiously from a strange but incomprehensibly warm sensation. A nightmare was born in her mind, in which icy horror was intertwined with an inexplicable attraction. The bloody hand of her companion slowly touched her cheek, leaving a sticky trace of someone else's death on her skin, and this gesture was simultaneously frightening and mesmerizing. Lavaine stood before her, his clothes soaked in the crimson blood of his enemies, and the fire of fanatical devotion burned in his eyes, and without looking away, he asked what Rudis wanted, making it clear that for her sake he was ready to cross any line. But the beauty herself lay among the mangled bodies, surrounded by the remains of those who dared to become her enemies, and breathing with difficulty, she whispered, with just her lips, that she wanted only one thing, that no one could ever harm her again, but part of her words were lost in the whisper of the wind. Morning had arrived, soft golden light was streaming through the high windows, filling the chambers with a warm glow, and its rays breaking through the heavy scarlet curtains created a whimsical play of shadows, announcing the beginning of a new day. The massive carved table still bore the marks of a recent meal, a multitude of empty, ornately patterned plates, dim candles, whose flames had died down, leaving only thin strands of smoke and the faint aroma of fresh bread still lingering in the air. Rudy sat at the table, looking down at the tea set, while an adult priest dressed in strict robes slowly filled her cup with a dark amber drink, and the steam from the hot tea rose up, dissolving into the morning air. The noblewoman carefully raised the cup to her lips, feeling the warmth of the porcelain in her palms, and taking a leisurely sip, closed her eyes for a moment, enjoying the tart taste of the drink, which for a moment allowed her to forget herself amidst the chaos of recent events. With a barely perceptible thud, she placed the cup back on the saucer, the sound echoing throughout the room, breaking the silence, and at that moment, her fingers trembled slightly, as if to indicate that the thoughts tormenting her mind had not yet completely left her. A faint, slightly awkward smile flickered across her face as she looked away and carefully asked the priest if she was allowed to take a walk alone, wanting to be alone with her own thoughts for a while, to feel the air of freedom. Before her stretched magnificent gardens, paved paths, leading to majestic staircases, arches entwined with greenery and flowers shimmering with bright colors, as if inviting her into their world where beauty remained untouched by intrigue and fear. The noblewoman walked slowly along the path, wrapped in a warm cloak, her breath dissolving in the cool morning air, and around her spread a picture of peaceful beauty. Not far away, there was a pond strewn with delicate lotuses. The water in it seemed serene. But suddenly, the silence was broken by a familiar voice coming from very close. Someone was calling her name and obeying an impulse. The girl instantly turned around, her heart stopped for a moment before it began to beat faster. Lavaine stood before her, his gaze full of a mysterious calm confidence, and holding out his hand to her, he quietly called her to follow him without explaining anything, but this invitation was enough for her to nod without hesitation and take a step forward. As if by the will of the gods, snow began to fall slowly from the sky, in a matter of moments, enveloping the flower-beds' paved paths and spreading trees in white blankets, and the light, frosty air wove through her hair, tangling the silky strands. She walked forward, pushing through the swirl of snowflakes that swirled around her in a chaotic dance, as if the heavens themselves had decided to hide the truth from her, and the piercing wind burned her skin with icy touches, while her gaze wandered desperately in search. It was only when her feet sank into the deep snow near a lonely tree that she finally noticed him. Lavaine stood there silently looking at her, not a single emotion flickering on his face, and the thin shirt clinging to his body did not give the slightest sign that he felt the cold. The charming man obediently turned in her direction as soon as she called him, drawing his attention to herself, and at that very moment, his gaze softened, and a light, almost weightless smile played on his large lips, as if the guy had been waiting for this loud call. Lavaine looked at her with warmth, but with a subtle hint of mockery in his eyes, and bowing his head gently asked if she had managed to rest after everything that had happened, as if there were no secrets between them, and he knew her answer in advance. The noblewoman froze her fingers involuntarily, clutching the edge of her cloak, and a brooch flashed coldly on her chest, as if reminding her of their recent conversation, and her heart began to beat faster when she realized that the young man was clearly aware of her father's arrival, although she had not said a word to him about it. The handsome man instantly caught the change in her mood, the subtle shadow of tension in her gaze, and squinting with undisguised interest, asked her directly, does she consider him suspicious since he knows so much about her, as if he is watching her every move? The noblewoman nodded awkwardly in agreement, feeling the tension constraining her movements, and her thoughts were racing around in disarray, trying to find at least some justification for her indecision, but every phrase that came to her mind seemed unconvincing and empty. God, remaining unperturbed, simply calmly explained that he had not been able to move forward until now, because the princess had not bothered to clearly state what exactly she wanted to receive from him and what goals she set for him, and without her will, he could not act at full strength. The lady, looking away in embarrassment, carefully admitted that she did not know exactly how the young man would act if she did voice her true desires to him, and therefore, fearing his unpredictable decisions, she preferred to remain silent, avoiding the need to make a final choice. But the god suddenly interrupted her words, gently, but confidently, noting that everything turned out to be much simpler than she imagined, and there was no point in wasting so much energy worrying, when the answer lay right in front of her, waiting only for a bold step forward. Waving his hand towards the girl, he warned her that he wanted to give her one visual example so that she would better understand the essence of his words, and without wasting time, he slowly moved forward, leaving behind footprints in the snowdrifts as he step by step approached her standing by the old tree. When the distance between them had shortened, the man, without taking his eyes off her, suddenly asked a simple but seemingly significant question. What time of year did she like the most? What awakened warm feelings in her heart? The lady, a little embarrassed, lowered her gaze and thought for a moment before quietly admitting that spring had always been the most precious time of year for her because it was at this time that nature came to life, giving hope for a new beginning. Hearing her answer, Levain narrowed his eyes slyly and with a slightly mocking smile on his lips, nodded as if confirming his own thoughts, and then calmly noted that he had no doubt about it, because even earlier he had guessed that spring had always been her favorite time. Suddenly, the noblewoman raised her head sharply, and her gaze was filled with genuine surprise. Right before her eyes, in the middle of a snowy landscape, delicate flowers began to bloom on the bare branches of an old tree, as if spring had suddenly arrived in defiance of all the laws of nature. Lush buds of scarlet and pink hues opened one after another, exuding a subtle, enchanting aroma that filled the air around, creating a feeling of something almost magical, as if time itself had submitted to someone else's will. Calmly observing her reaction, the young man explained with a slight smile that one of his abilities allows him to control the age of objects and living beings. For example, he can make a tree bloom despite the depth of winter, changing its flow of time. But then the boy slowly extended his hand, and one of the bright petals, finding itself in his fingers, suddenly began to darken, wrinkle, and crumble into dust, as if it had lived a long life in just one moment before disappearing forever. The noblewoman, standing in a stupefied daze, could not hide her amazement. The god's abilities turned out to be far more grandiose than she could have imagined, and the realization of his power made her hold her breath in awe of what she saw. Levain, looking straight into the noblewoman's eyes, said without a shadow of a doubt that he was ready to fulfill any of her orders, if only it was within his capabilities, because his purpose was to obey her will and make her wishes come true. Rudy's froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and her eyes widened in shock, betraying doubt. She could not believe her ears, realizing how much power she now held in her hands and what a burden could fall on her shoulders. The young man, noticing her confusion, gently added that despite all his power, he was not an omnipotent being. His magic had its limits, and even he was not able to change everything in this world with the snap of his fingers. At that moment, the girl felt a magic circle awaken on her body. It began to glow with a soft pink light, as if reminding her that the deity had already accepted her instructions, meaning that her will was now absolute law for him. Finally, taking a deep breath, the noblewoman raised her head, firmly met his gaze, and spoke her first words of command. She wanted him to save the empire from the monsters, for if anyone could handle it, it was him. The young man, with a slight mockery in his gaze, bowed his head, studying the expression on her face, and shaking his head, declared that he did not believe in the sincerity of her desire, because his ears heard lies, and therefore ordered her to tell him the true request, coming from the depths of her heart, without fear and hesitation. Dear Rudy's froze, her lips parted, but the words refused to leave her tongue because she could not understand whether there was any difference between her personal desires and the good of the empire. Shouldn't she put the fates of others above her own whims? Lavaine, smiling, said softly but insistently that she could wish for anything, because his existence served the fulfillment of her will, whatever it might be, selfish, meaningless, in the eyes of others, because divine power does not judge desires. The confused noblewoman looked down nervously, clenching her fingers, and with a trembling voice, admitted that she had no idea what she really wanted, because all her life her desires had been determined by others, and now, when opportunities opened up before her, for the first time, she felt lost. In the palace, all eyes were constantly focused on Selena. Her presence illuminated the halls, forcing everyone to admire her beauty, while Rudy's, like a shadow, remained on the sidelines, not attracting attention, and at such moments, she felt as if the world was deliberately putting her in second place. Tears rolled down her cheeks in large drops, and looking out the window at the endless distances, she suddenly remembered her long-standing, almost forgotten desire to leave this cold palace and go as far away as possible to a place where there would be no burden of court intrigues and other people's expectations. The young man, observing her reaction, chuckled. A slight mockery sounded in his voice, and he calmly said that this could not be the girl's true desire, because if she really wanted to leave with all her heart, she would have left this place long ago without looking back. Suddenly, her hearing caught someone's mysterious voice. It sounded soft but insistent, calling her by name and convincing her that the moment had come to break free from the shackles, escape from here forever, and finally become truly free. But where these words came from, she did not understand. The bright rays of the sun cut painfully into her eyes, forcing her to close them, and covering her face with her hand, she tried to hide from the blinding light, but an inner uneasiness did not leave her, as if she had a premonition that this day would be the beginning of something inevitable. Although Rudiz didn't yet fully understand what exactly she wanted from life, and her thoughts remained confused, one thing was certain: more than anything in the world she craved freedom, the one that would allow her to live according to her own choice, without the shackles of duty and other people's expectations. The man, carefully watching her reaction, nodded with a slight smile, agreeing to fulfill her wish, because these were the words he was waiting for from her. And finally, they were spoken like a seal, sealing their mysterious connection that existed long before this moment. Coming closer to the girl, he looked straight into her eyes, and in his gaze, one could read not only confidence, but also something deep, incomprehensible, after which he quietly but persistently asked her to relax, allowing himself to let go of her worries, at least for a moment. Lavaine slowly embraced her, touching her with the warmth of his palms, and then leaning down, touched her forehead with his lips, whispering that he had been waiting for this moment for 5,000 years, and now that she had finally voiced her wish, he would fulfill it no matter what the cost. Feeling the heat rise in her cheeks, the girl, without hiding her excitement, carefully asked if this meant that she would have to accompany him to the war zone to see with her own eyes the destruction he would cause as he dealt with the monsters. However, the young man merely waved his hand dismissively, noting with a slight grin that the main difficulty lay not in his strength at all, but in the state of his body, which did not yet allow him to fully fight the monsters, as the situation required. Rudy's, with difficulty finding the words, tried to explain that she could not leave the palace earlier because her disappearance would have caused chaos, and not only in the royal family, but also among the nobility, because the princess's escape would have caused confusion and panic. Then, having collected her thoughts, the girl timidly asked if he could do something for her right now, but hearing a soft refusal, she only nodded silently, and Lavaine added that if she ever needed anything, she only had to say so, and he would immediately come to her aid. With these words, the young man disappeared into thin air, leaving the girl alone in the middle of the garden, where only the wind, gently playing with her hair, was the only silent witness to her thoughts, hidden deep in her heart. The Duchy of Arctis, renowned for its power, was a majestic city with wealthy quarters, where luxurious buildings towered, and in the very center, like a symbol of power, the royal palace rose majestically. In the spacious room, where the soft candlelight reflected on the smooth surface of the polished oak table, stood an elegant porcelain cup filled with hot tea from which a subtle spicy aroma rose, enveloping the air with a light haze of comfort and peace. Selena clenched her slender fingers into fists in irritation, her nails digging into her palms when she heard from the servants that the Duke had refused to meet with her, citing urgent matters, and this news only intensified the storm of indignation boiling in her soul. The princess could barely contain her trembling with indignation, her slender fingers convulsively clenched into fists, and her chest heaved with indignation because she had already waited patiently for almost an hour, dressed in a scarlet dress, adorned with jewels, but he still had not bothered to appear. However, the silence was suddenly broken by the voice of a servant solemnly announcing the arrival of Seriphus, and at that very moment the anger disappeared from Selina's face, replaced by genuine joy, and her heart fluttered in anticipation of the long-awaited meeting. Jumping up from her seat, barely restraining herself from breaking into a run, Selina quickly walked towards the young man, whose silhouette had already appeared in the doorway, and her heart fluttered with anticipation of this unexpected meeting. Seriphus was a young man whose youth and beauty attracted attention. Thick chestnut curls fell slightly on his forehead, a silvery gaze from under long eyelashes seemed piercing, and his uniform emphasized his stately figure because he was the grandson of the Duke himself. However, contrary to the lady's expectations, he showed neither joy nor warmth at the meeting, but on the contrary, he said rudely and distantly that he had come only because she had been so persistently waiting for him, not wanting to leave this place, and his words sounded like a reproach. The aristocrat froze her lips, stretching into an uncomprehending smile. Usually their communication was light, almost friendly, but now there was a coldness in his voice that she had never felt before, and it confused her. Seriphus, noticing her confusion, only grinned, and looking intently into her eyes, said that he would like to hear her answer. How would she deal with a man who would betray her feelings and trample on her love, leaving nothing but ashes? The girl froze, her gaze clouded over with growing incomprehension, and her heart sank painfully in her chest, and with a trembling voice, she began to ask why he was saying such things, because she had never betrayed him, remaining true to her feelings. Seriphus looked down in disappointment and said no more, only turned sharply and walked quickly away from the princess, throwing a dry remark over his shoulder about how he didn't have time, because it was time for him to leave, and his voice sounded distant, as if he had already closed his heart to her. He gripped the cold, time-worn doorknob tightly about to take a step forward and leave this place, when a tension hung in the air, as if fate itself was trying to hold him back in this moment, before he finally left. However, the door slammed behind the boy with a heavy, booming sound, cutting him off from the room, where only the girl remained alone among the empty walls, and the silence that followed his departure seemed deafening, as if fate itself had put the final point in this story. Soft daylight poured through the window, penetrating the room with golden rays, as if reminding her that behind these walls, the world continued to live. People went about their business, laughed, talked, and only here in this corner, time stood still, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The priest, looking closely at his interlocutor's face, asked him an important question, wondering if he had managed to find out whether it was possible to accept the patronage of the duchy, since much depended on it, including their future fate and future. And indeed, Rudy's, bowing her head in a respectful gesture, with hope in her voice, asked to be taken under the protection of the duchy's temple, believing that it was there that she could find a new home peace and a place where fate would finally stop testing her with cruel trials. The young man nodded calmly, confirming that her request had been granted and was now officially accepted. And then, after a short pause, he turned to the princess with a question whether she was acquainted with the Duke's grandson, whose name was Seriphus, and whether they had ever had the opportunity to cross paths. The girl, frowning slightly, replied that she had no idea who he was and had never met him in person, but she had heard various rumors about him more than once, although she was not sure how much of them were true and whether it was worth giving them any importance at all. The guy, looking thoughtfully to the side, said that she should not worry about the heir to the duchy, because despite all the speculation and talk, this man would not cause her any harm, and her safety would not depend on his presence. Suddenly, clear, confident steps were heard in the corridor, breaking the silence, and at that moment, the priest, slowly rising from his seat, noted with a slight smile that apparently Sir Seriphus had already arrived and would soon appear before them. The priests, filled with awe, bowed in respect as the high priest and the princess slowly emerged from the chambers, enveloped in an aura of grandeur that made those around them hold their breath in respect for their high status. Then Seriphus, who was standing among them in the corridor, looked at what was happening with slight surprise, and then, with a raised eyebrow, asked whether the emperor's daughter herself was really present here, since he had not expected such an important meeting in this place. Rudy's, maintaining impeccable posture, folded her hands in front of her and greeted the heir of a noble family with impeccable politeness, because in such circumstances, every word and gesture had meaning and could influence the further course of events. The young man immediately bowed his head in acknowledgement of his mistake and sincerely apologized for his earlier rudeness, recognizing his temporary lack of manners, which was unacceptable when dealing with a person of such high birth. And then, possessing natural charm and a noble bearing, he introduced himself gallantly, raised the lady's hand to his lips, and lightly touching it with firmness in his voice, delivered a solemn speech about how his loyalty to the empire was unbreakable and he would serve it until the end of his days. Raising her head up, Rudy suddenly felt an inexplicable uneasiness, as if something in the air had changed, disrupting the usual order of things, and overcome by a strange premonition, she began to look around, trying to understand the reason for this uneasy feeling. The woman's gaze lingered on a distant corner of the palace corridor, where a familiar figure flashed around the bend, a girl lurking in the shadow of the columns, whose tense breathing and movements, constrained by rage, betrayed the intensity of emotions that she was trying in vain to hide. It was Selena, and with her fists clenched until her knuckles turned white, she couldn't tear her fiery gaze away from the scene unfolding before her, feeling jealousy consuming her from within, because seeing how Seraphis was behaving with Rudy's was an unbearable ordeal for her. Meanwhile, despite the worry that flashed in his eyes, the young man continued with restraint, announcing that a special room had already been prepared for Rudy's, furnished with her status and comfort in mind, where she would be able to live comfortably throughout her stay here. The charming noblewoman was delighted to hear that she would finally have her own room, which no one could enter without her permission, and most importantly, she would be far from her father's influence, giving her the freedom she so desired. When she, not wanting to miss such a rare opportunity, the noblewoman instantly made a decision, and without hesitation agreed to move right then and there, realizing that this was her chance to start life in a new place, free from the shackles of the past. Bowing his head before the princess as a sign of respect, the young man said that he would immediately escort her to her new home, the Grand Duchy of Arctis, where she would now live surrounded by the peace and grandeur of this noble family. The carriage stopped at the entrance to an ancient church, its graceful outlines reflected in the midday light, and next to the vehicle stood two people, the princess herself and her companion, ready to set off on a journey that might change their destinies forever. There in the distance, out of the corner of her eye, Rudis noticed a familiar silhouette. Selena was standing near the column, holding her breath, clearly trying to remain unnoticed, but at the same time watching them intently, as if her gaze was riveted to what was happening for some reason known only to her. The carriage, ready for departure, stood on sturdy wooden wheels, its door handle glinting in the sunlight, its heavy trim giving the vehicle a stately and aristocratic appearance, befitting its high-ranking occupants. Finally, the young couple, without wasting any time, got into the spacious carriage, and it, smoothly moving from its place, headed towards the palace, leaving behind the priests, who, bowing respectfully, followed them with long, thoughtful glances. The noblewoman, feeling a slight thrill, carefully pulled back the luxurious scarlet curtain, revealing a panorama of new places flashing past the window, and with undisguised curiosity watched the landscape change during their leisurely journey. Suddenly, a keen interest lit up the beauty's eyes. A completely new world full of grandeur opened up before her, because for the first time in her life, she had left her home, leaving behind the walls that had fettered her freedom since childhood and prevented her from seeing what lay beyond them. The city streets were striking in their splendor. Majestic monuments towered amidst spacious squares. The architecture of the buildings was refined and elegant, as if each stone held the history of centuries, and the narrow alleys breathed the secrets of the past. The girl couldn't take her eyes off the window, enchanted not only by the beauty of the city landscapes, but also by the nature that was gradually beginning to replace the urban landscapes. Dense forests spreading trees and delicate flowers filled her heart with joy. When their carriage finally stopped, enveloped in the silence of expectation, the young man stepped gracefully out first, and then, with his unfailing gallantry, he leaned forward, slightly, extending his hand to his companion to help her down. They finally arrived at the majestic Duchy of Arctis, and before them stood a grand mansion, immersed in luxury and the grace of architectural art. High towers proudly rose to the sky, and servants lined up in a respectful bow in front of the main entrance. Rudy's glanced around at the majestic house and stepped forward with excitement, but losing concentration on her movements, she suddenly stumbled. Her light shoes slid on the polished steps, and the next moment the girl felt herself losing her balance. However, the fall was not destined to happen. The young man with lightning-fast reflexes confidently caught her, holding her tightly, not allowing her to fall, and their gazes met for a moment, capturing in the air a moment of unexpected closeness. Immediately, a magical circle of protection flared up on the lady's neck, enveloping her in a soft glow, making her realize that divine power had once again saved her from trouble, and feeling a slight blush on her cheeks, she quietly thanked the heavens for this sign. Not wanting to linger any longer, the young Rudy straightened up, and gaining confidence, resolutely walked forward, leaving the aristocrat behind, as if deliberately emphasizing that this house would now become her new place where she would build her future. With horror feeling the cold sweat appear on her face, the girl realized that the old pain in her left leg had made itself known again, piercing her with a sharp, unpleasant sensation, as if reminding her of the past that she so wanted to leave behind. Noticing that the beauty was clearly tired after the long journey and could barely contain her fatigue, the man, showing concern, firmly ordered the servants to disperse, making it clear that he himself intended to escort the lady to her chambers, not wanting to entrust this to someone else. The noblewoman, not wanting to reveal her inner weakness, only nodded silently in response, her gaze sliding to the side, avoiding meeting the stranger's eyes, perhaps out of shame, or perhaps because at that moment her every thought was drowning in an abyss of pain, fatigue, and bitter thoughts. The room prepared, especially for the aristocrat, was striking in its grandeur, spacious, immersed in exquisite shades, with a luxurious bed, graceful chairs and tables, as well as an elegant lamp whose soft lighting gave the space a cozy and warm atmosphere. Rudy's, having barely crossed the threshold, sat down with relief on the nearest chair, allowing herself to rest a little, and having glanced around the new environment, finally said that the chambers suited her perfectly, restrainedly, expressing her approval. Suddenly, the future duke, not hiding his anxiety, dropped to one knee in front of the noblewoman, his gaze tense, filled with inner anxiety, as if he was trying to penetrate her soul and understand how much pain she had to endure before she found herself in front of him. Bowing his head and avoiding her eyes, the young man spoke in a quiet, almost remorseful voice, admitting that he had not even thought about the fact that they might need the help of healers, and dared to ask permission to examine the lady's injured leg, hoping to somehow ease her suffering. Gritting her teeth, the girl bitterly admitted that the reason for her limp was not at all connected with a recent wound or bruise, as one might have assumed, but was a congenital feature with which she had had to live since childhood, not knowing what ease of movement meant. Frowning slightly, and not hiding his sincere surprise, the young man asked a question with incomprehension, trying to figure out what exactly the lady wanted to say, hiding in these words something more than just an admission of her weakness. With a slight smile that tinged with sadness, Rudy's calmly explained that such a disease was incurable, and no matter how much the doctors tried, no matter how much they gave her hope, she knew it was forever, and she was no longer able to change her fate. Every night, barely opening her eyes from the piercing pain, she quietly whispered prayers, hoping that the gods would hear her pleas and finally free her from this endless torment, which with each passing day took away her strength and forced her to come to terms with her own helplessness. The duke, sitting next to her, listened to her attentively, and thinking asked whether the emperor himself, her father, had taken any measures, whether he had called doctors to examine his daughter's leg and at least try to find a way to alleviate her suffering. Hearing only a cold and dry "no" in response, the man suddenly felt anger boiling inside him, realizing that the ruler, possessing all possible power, did not even try to take care of his daughter, leaving her with her pain, as if her fate did not matter to him. However, realizing that he had allowed himself to speak too harshly, the young man lowered his gaze, sighed, and apologized, with sincere remorse for his lack of restraint, realizing that his harsh judgments could have caused her even more pain, although he did not want this at all. Having collected his thoughts, he firmly stated that if she did not object, he would take responsibility for her health himself and hire the best doctors to examine her, and perhaps offer at least some treatment that could alleviate her suffering. The noblewoman hesitated, not knowing whether to trust him, but the aristocrat, sensing her doubts, began to calmly talk about his experience in medicine, which he acquired on the battlefield among wounded soldiers, where every piece of knowledge could become a matter of life and death. Then, in a calm and respectful manner, he asked her if she would mind if he placed his hand on her knee to examine and assess her condition, assuring her that he would do everything as carefully and gently as possible without causing discomfort. Clutching the hem of her dress with her fingertips, as if searching for a hint of reassurance in the gesture, the sweet lady calmly but firmly replied that she was fine, making it clear that she did not wish to make any unnecessary fuss about her long-standing problem. Having received such a restrained but nevertheless permission, the handsome man gently but insistently ordered her to relax, take a deep breath, calm down, and not tense her muscles so that the examination would proceed without unnecessary tension and embarrassment. His warm hands gently wrapped around her leg. The touch was soft, almost caressing, and listening to her breathing, he asked in a quiet but confident voice if such contact hurt her, carefully watching her reaction. The noblewoman shuddered, but overcame herself and squeezed out a barely audible confession that everything was fine, and only the light feeling of his fingers through the fabric reminded her that he was really there at that moment, showing concern to which she had long been unaccustomed. His hand tightened its grip on her leg, carefully, but confidently, turning it in different directions, trying to feel for possible injuries, check the joints, and assess how serious everything was, but he didn't even imagine that his touches would cause an unexpected reaction. Suddenly, a loud, piercing scream escaped the noblewoman's lips, and the young man immediately froze, looking at her face in confusion, trying to figure out whether he had hurt her or if something else had happened. His voice was full of concern when he asked if everything was all right. The girl blushed to the tips of her ears. Embarrassment completely overwhelmed her, and a magical seal flared on her skin, emitting a light, barely noticeable glow, as if revealing her true feelings. Gathering her courage, she awkwardly asked him to let go of her leg. A look of genuine shock flashed across the young man's face, and a silent question was frozen in his eyes. He had not expected such a turn of events at all, and the realization of what was happening caught him off guard, leaving him speechless for a few moments. Puzzled, letting go of the beauty's slender leg, the young man frowned, and with undisguised surprise in his voice, asked what this mysterious magical symbol was that covered her neck and collarbones, and how such a bizarre sign could have appeared on her body. The girl, staring blankly into space, admitted with some hesitation that she herself could not explain the origin of this seal, since it had appeared suddenly, after a mysterious and dark sacrificial ritual that she preferred not to talk about. The guy, having overcome a momentary stupor, resolutely rose to his feet, looked at the girl with concern, and quietly said that the most important thing for her now was to get some rest, and in the meantime, he would take care of her and bring something sweet, asking the servants for a treat. Disappointed but truly touched to the depths of her soul, Rudice bowed her head in gratitude to the Duke's heir, expressing her appreciation for the kindness he had shown her, for the care she had not known for a long time, and for giving her the opportunity to find a new home and a sense of security. Seraphis froze in a slight daze, because he hadn't really done anything significant for her, but despite this, the girl looked at him with such sincere gratitude that he even felt awkward, and then quietly remarked that she should devote more time to rest. When the massive door slammed behind him with a soft echo, he slowly leaned his back against it, closing his eyes, and mentally noted how naive and sincere this princess was, as if she lived in a world where kindness and justice still existed. The emperor had always been known for his cruelty and inhumane methods of rule, but even he could not afford to threaten a neighboring duchy while the protracted war against the monsters continued, and strong allies were vital for his crown. Rudice's existence was a blessing in itself, as her birth marked a turning point in the fate of this world. She gained the power to end a protracted war that had torn the lands apart for years and claimed thousands of lives. Seraph bowing respectfully before the Duke's heir, the butler, with a serious expression on his face, assured him that the order would be carried out in the blink of an eye, and without wasting time, hurried to take up the task entrusted to him. Meanwhile, the young lady from the Viscount's family sat in her room, surrounded by curious listeners, and enthusiastically spread rumors about how frightening the process of escorting a guest to Selena's chambers was, and how terrifying the emperor looked that day. Her interlocutor slowly and elegantly raised the cup to her lips, took a small sip of the aromatic tea, and thought for a moment, enjoying its delicate taste and warmth before continuing the conversation. Ivana, as this refined lady was called, looked at her interlocutor with a slight smile and slightly squinting her eyes, calmly said that it was completely unbecoming for them, the princess's simple servants, to interfere in political intrigues and try to understand the plans of people in power. The Viscount's daughter, suddenly struck by a thought, sat up straight and blurted out in a stunned voice that all these strange events had probably begun to happen precisely after the mysterious and no doubt powerful summoning ritual. The conversation gradually shifted to the topic of the ancient deity, and the noblewoman, taking another thoughtful sip of her drink, inquired about what information had been gathered about such a mysterious god, whose image was shrouded in secrets and ancient legends passed down from mouth to mouth. The two of them discussed how Selena could have been the source of all these rumors about a false deity, and what had actually happened at that fateful moment in the ritual when the boundaries between myth and reality seemed to become blurry like shadows in candlelight. But since Ivana, smiling, meanly thought with obvious contempt about how naive and stupid Selena was, since she dared to challenge the will of the deity himself, not realizing the full depth of the consequences that could fall upon her for such a bold decision. Night enveloped the world in thick darkness. The gloom steadily thickened outside the large windows, and the scarlet curtains, like frozen tongues of flame, swayed rhythmically in the draught, casting strange shadows on the iron bars, evoking a feeling of anxiety and impending disaster. The lady's servant, casting a wary glance at her mistress, dared to ask what action she was planning to take, because if the rumors were really motivated by nothing more than jealousy, this could have serious consequences for Ivana herself. But Giselle, running her slender fingers over the documents laid out on the table, the aristocrat declared with cold determination that no matter what their doubts, they should under no circumstances go against the will of the deity, for such disobedience could lead to consequences. In his letter, the lady's father made it clear that the true power of this ancient god was closely linked to Alpha, and that is why opposing him meant bringing on a disaster, the scale of which was difficult to even imagine. The Dutch two hands firmly sealed the treaty, a firm handshake symbolizing the alliance that bound two powerful worlds, a sign of inviolability and loyalty so necessary to maintain peace between the duchy and the Great Temple. Alpha was the name of the first document that sealed the union of the temple and the duchy, a shining book full of secrets and ancient knowledge containing not only the most important laws and obligations, but also the key principles on which the future of both sides depended, determining their fate for many centuries. The lovely Ivana, although she had not read this book, was sure that among its pages there would certainly be a mention of the old deity they were now talking about, for a connection with this being was too important for their cunning and vile plan. Giselle immediately straightened up, ready to listen to the mistress's new order as soon as she addressed her, realizing that her further behavior would depend on what exact instructions she received from sweet Ivana at that moment. The long corridor of the mansion was engulfed in darkness, and in its depths, hidden from the eyes of casual witnesses, two figures argued heatedly as if their words could change the very essence of what was happening, and neither opinion yielded to the other. One of the figures in a dark cloak, a man with obvious tension in his voice, tried to convince his companion that the information they were discussing was under the strict control of the temple, and it could not be revealed or distributed simply without the knowledge of higher powers. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a strange voice, which with clear insistence asked whether what they were discussing was really true, and his words instantly made them think, confirming that their guesses and assumptions might not have been so far from the truth. It was the emperor himself, surrounded by his loyal guards, his stern face deeply lined, and expressing furious anger immediately attracted attention, making it clear that he was determined and ready to find out the whole truth without missing a single detail. The priest and the lady bowed deeply before the ruler, who demanded an immediate answer from them, asking whether the truth they spoke of was in fact true, and their demeanor was full of respect and awe. The hooded holy man, with a slight and barely noticeable smirk on his face, confirmed that everything they had said was indeed true, but his words were tinged with such suspicion that it left everyone present with an uneasy feeling. Soon, the Seriphus, sitting next to her calmly and confidently, explained that this was their first destination on a long journey, and that despite all the strangeness of this place, It was an important step towards their goal, which was yet to be achieved. The table was laden with a variety of dishes and treats, including fresh bread, fragrant sweets, and other delicacies, which created an atmosphere of comfort and hospitality. Their aromas were inviting and promised satisfaction, satisfying every taste. The aristocrat shuddered when she learned that they were heading to this place, realizing that now their lives would be indebted to them, and she in turn would be obliged to fulfill some obligations that she might prefer to avoid, because it imposed certain restrictions on her. An awkward silence hung between them, as if the very atmosphere of this moment, this strange and uncertain moment, forced them both to remain silent, and the silence became more and more noticeable, as if it were enveloping them, not allowing them to continue the conversation. She did slowly. Rudy's, with obvious bewilderment, asked whether he really had to go to this place, because she could not understand how his duty could be so important that it required such determination and so easily justified such risks in an uncertain situation. Later, the emperor opened the meeting by saying that, as they all already knew the city of Heart had been chosen as the first point for the location and provision of aid to the deities, which gave the place special significance and attracted the attention of the entire political elite. The man sat at the head of the table, where he was clearly visible to all, wearing a fur cape that emphasized his status and power, and his calm but commanding presence brought order and calm to this important gathering. With a firm gaze that remained motionless, he added that they had all been gathered here to eliminate all uncertainties, disagreements, and finally gain the necessary discipline in political issues that had long required attention and resolution. The aristocrats bowed their heads awkwardly and fell silent, immersed in a silence that was filled with discomfort and tension, as everyone understood that the conversation would most likely touch on sensitive topics that they would prefer to avoid. None of them particularly believed that the god was real and true, and not fake as many claimed, and in this context, Rudice's position became especially strong, because now she was the very high character who controlled this god, becoming increasingly influential. The emperor. Suddenly, a servant approached the ruler and quietly whispered to him the latest news, that the long-awaited guest had finally arrived, and this news became a turning point that attracted the attention of everyone present, making them expect new events. The man, having heard the latest news loudly and authoritatively, announced to everyone present that they should immediately let the guest inside, and at that very moment, all eyes instantly turned to the door in anticipation of the appearance of someone who might bring new twists to the situation. Her long purple hair, adorned with a ribbon, fluttered in the wind, as if the very branches of nature were reaching out to her, creating an image of lightness and refined grace, as if the elements themselves were emphasizing the importance of her presence in this important moment. It was Rudy's striding forward with elegance, and beside her, with a composed and confident air, walked the Duke's heir. They had come to the meeting, and their appearance, the restraint and determination of their movements, made it clear that they had come here with a purpose. With his hands folded in front of him, the emperor greeted his daughter, the princess, with an indifferent and cold expression on his face as she entered the room, his gaze expressing neither joy nor excitement, as if he did not care about her presence. Rumors about the princess and her connection to the false god immediately began to spread throughout the room, which only added to the tension at the moment and gave rise to new questions that forced everyone gathered to seek answers to the unexpected events. Frowning, Barthold couldn't help but wonder why Rudy's had come here after he thought she had left her family behind, and now found herself back in this room, raising questions that seemed like they should have been resolved long ago. Lady Rudy's, with a saddened voice, protested, saying that it was not she who abandoned her family, but rather it was the emperor who abandoned her, forcing her to leave, which turned everything that had been said before upside down and made her appear in a different light. Waving his hand in obvious displeasure, the man ordered them to move on to the main issue, and without hiding his irritation, asked why she had come here interrupting such an important meeting at which the key issues of their empire were being discussed. The beautiful noblewoman, looking up with determination and confidence, replied that she would prefer to choose another place for the god to move to, instead of the city of Heart, believing that this decision could significantly change the course of future events. The ruler of the empire did not like this idea at all, since the city of Vignoud was exposed to all 5 stages of infection, and its salvation was practically impossible, which complicated any attempt to restore its former state. Bartold chuckled, with barely perceptible contempt, saying that such a place was useless to save, and that he never saw his daughter at the meetings, since she could hardly understand the complex political issues that were discussed there. The lady, feeling she had to answer the question, asked if her father had chosen the City of Heart solely because they were in desperate need of help, so that those who provided assistance would then be indebted to the empire, which seemed like a perfectly logical move. Her last words, spoken with a light but confident tone, were the assertion that it was in this city that all the nobility gentry and influential figures were concentrated who in the future could reward them for such an important service as saving the city. The entire noble company inside the room froze in complete silence. None of those present dared to answer, because it was a bitter truth that could not be refuted, and everyone understood that the lady's words accurately reflected the reality of their situation. Suddenly, the white-haired count, hunched over with indignation, protested, saying that the princess should not have insulted them like that, because how could she even think that they were saving the city for money when they acted out of the most noble motives? Rudis mockingly asked the lord if he really thought that the City of Heart needed help more than Vigneault, because her view of the situation was completely different, and she found it difficult to believe in such a one-sided decision. The man loudly declared that the girl simply did not understand all the subtleties and hidden nuances of what was happening, which is why she behaved so naively and inexperiencedly, not realizing that her every word and decision here had serious and far-reaching consequences for everyone present. The aristocrats sitting in their chairs immediately supported the count, exclaiming that the princess was certainly unreasonable and did not have sufficient understanding of the political situation, which became clear to anyone who even slightly understood all the subtleties of what was happening. Everyone present began to look at the lady with obvious disdain, as if she were an insignificant figure among them, and spoke mockingly, claiming that she should have concentrated on preparing for her departure, rather than trying to interfere in such complex matters. Suddenly, another voice rang out, calling for their attention and ordering them to finally stop these useless disputes, which only distracted them from solving the main problem, and calling everyone to a unified, more constructive approach. Rudy, shocked, turned around abruptly, recognizing the familiar voice that had spoken those words, and instantly realizing who exactly had spoken. She felt deep surprise and shock, because in front of her stood the person she had not expected to encounter at that moment. He was a young man with red hair, his bangs falling to one side, and the firm look of his dark eyes and his stubborn posture gave him a determined and confident appearance, as if he was ready to stand up to anyone who dared to challenge his opinion. The earl suddenly rose from his seat, slamming his fist on the table, his voice full of anger, and he asked whether the charming Lord Abbot was in his right mind, saying such things, which in his opinion were utterly absurd and could not correspond to common sense. The man waved his hand to the side as if brushing off the count's indignation, and calmly said that one could argue with this, even with a small child who would undoubtedly agree that helping the city of Vigneault would bring much more benefit than supporting Hart. Abbot, looking haughtily at the other aristocrats gathered in the room, asked with disdain whether they had really all gathered for such a petty reason, considering that discussing a matter which in his opinion was obvious was not at all worth their attention. Rudis confirmed that, as the count had said, the first destination for aid should have been Vigneault, as this city was in a much more critical situation than Hart and needed support much more. The emperor had no choice but to object, for it was clear to all that Vigneault was indeed in a much worse position, and after thinking for a moment, he reluctantly agreed to the proposal, realizing that he could not ignore this fact. The ruler said mockingly that he found it difficult to understand how the lady still remained in doubt, despite the fact that he had already agreed to all her conditions, and now her position did not seem as confident and decisive as before, when she protested. His gaze remained cold and penetrating, as did his words, in which he confirmed, without any emotion, that all her fears were in vain, and the deity was indeed real, and this entire situation was not subject to further discussion. Then the priest, with obvious wariness in his voice, told him that the god who had come was absolutely real, and that any attempt to resist him would end in disaster, because resistance would come at a price too high for anyone to pay. With a sly grin, as if enjoying the situation, the man turned to the lady again, asking if she had any other complaints or suggestions, as if this whole conversation was just a game in which he already knew the outcome and controlled her every step. Rudy's, bowing her head, replied submissively that she had nothing more to add since everything she could say had already been said, and now all that remained was to await the decision which in her opinion was inevitable since everything was predetermined. Standing in the conference room, they continued to discuss that the princess would set off on a journey tomorrow, and the decision had been made, but everyone understood that the future of the city she was heading to depended on many factors, including the will of the gods. Finally, the emperor, with a heavy and determined look, said that he did not care where his daughter went, but she must understand that she should not count on the help of the imperial family. His words sounded with cruelty and malice, clearly showing his indifference. Rudy stood stunned and amazed, her eyes filled with wonder and bewilderment, how her father could not believe in the power of the ancient gods, who in her opinion were supposed to be the key to saving their ambitions and destiny, and how he could ignore their power. She stood before her parent, unsure how to respond to his displeased expression and cold refusal to help, feeling a woman's heart clench with indecision, fighting for calm, but having no words to say anything in response. Evening slowly descended upon the earth, and the sun, as if tired after a long journey, quietly hid behind the majestic walls of the Duke's mansion, painting the sky in soft, warm shades of pink and gold, as if foreshadowing something important. Having brought a soft pillow and a snow-white fluffy blanket, she thought about how cold it would be at night and diligently tried to create comfort, surrounding herself with soft fabrics, as if they could hide her from the cruel reality and give her at least a little peace. He walked slowly down the street, carrying laundry in his hands, and immersed in his thoughts, doing important things, but still feeling like something important was slipping away from him, creating a feeling of anxiety as if the moment had been missed and the decision was difficult. Rudy's was completely shocked by how much they were planning to take with them on this trip and watched the packing with surprise and bewilderment, feeling like she was losing all understanding of why they needed so much stuff for such a short journey. The butler, bowing deeply with due respect, announced that every item they had collected was necessary for her comfortable journey, and all these supplies had been carefully selected with her needs in mind so that nothing could disturb her comfort on the journey. Rudy's tried to resist what was happening, saying with slight irritation and insistence that she absolutely did not need so many things because she was sure that all this would only add unnecessary trouble and complicate their journey without bringing any benefit. But the butler insisted on his own because the lady was a princess, which meant that her comfort and well-being should always come first, and all these numerous preparations were only evidence of deep concern for her high position. The beauty, slightly bowing her head and sadly thinking about what was happening, could not understand why everyone was trying so hard for her, because she knew that it was because of her that the Duke's heir was setting off on this dangerous and unpredictable journey. The servant, watching her confusion, closely explained that they were all deeply grateful to her because she was willing to fight the greedy and vile rich, fighting for what she considered just, and was willing to defend the weak and oppressed despite the risks. They believed that money could buy everything, that wealth and power could solve any problem, but Rudis knew that true value lay in determination and courage, which could not be measured by any coins or riches. The common debt to the people, which the rich never fulfilled, fell on the shoulders of the neighboring duchy, which alone continued to support ordinary people, trying to somehow correct injustice and ensure their well-being in these difficult times. Embarrassed, trying to hide her excitement, the noblewoman stated that she had always been ready to support the Duke and all his endeavors, and even in the most difficult situations, she had never doubted his rightness and wisdom, ready to go by his side to the end. The butler smiled sweetly at his interlocutor, and slightly bowing his head, added that this was all he wanted to tell her, for he understood that words sometimes could not express all the care and respect that he felt for her as a princess. Night fell, and Rudis, feeling the need for peace and quiet, went out onto the balcony of the mansion to enjoy the fresh air, inhaling the scent of the night coolness, and thinking about what the next day would bring on this dangerous but exciting journey. Yard was wrapped in a warm, cozy cloak, which could not completely protect her from the cold, and despite this, steam still came from her mouth, which slowly dissolved into the night air like her thoughts carried away into the void. However, she was suddenly interrupted by a loud voice from behind, which asked with curiosity and slight surprise whether the aristocrat had woken up and why she had decided to go outside on such a late and frosty night when everyone else had long since rested. It was Lavaine who, coming closer, turned to the lady with interest, asking whether she had prepared a horse in advance for the upcoming journey, since the journey promised to be long and tiring, and such a moment did not tolerate delay. The gentle Rudy's, with a slight sigh, calmly explained to him that she had conveyed the nobleman's request, that the god wished to ride on horseback, and in order to avoid unnecessary expenses, they had found for him a good steed that would easily cope with the difficult journey. This satisfied the guy, because lately he really wanted to feel like a real person, to be freed from his responsibilities and burdens, and this opportunity gave him confidence, filling his soul with an unusual relief. However, this situation left the beauty perplexed, unable to understand why the ancient deity had suddenly decided to feel weak and mortal, since his mighty power had always been undeniable, and it was strange that he was now seeking vulnerability. At that moment, she remembered her father's words, which he spoke with a firm decision. He was not going to provide them with financial assistance, and this irritated her, because she knew how difficult it would be for them without his support in such a difficult situation. Levane noticed her wariness, and unable to resist, asked what was happening, because he immediately felt that something was bothering the lady, but he could not understand what exactly was hidden behind her expression and what caused this anxious worry in her heart. The lovely lady admitted that she was worried about what they would do when they arrived in the city, because the situation there was extremely difficult, the infection was at a high level, and this only increased her fears that they could end up in a dangerous situation. Suddenly, quite unexpectedly, the sweet young man began to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand, and his laughter sounded a little out of place against the backdrop of such a serious conversation, which only increased the bewilderment of the lady, who did not understand why he was reacting this way to her concerns. He turned his gaze to his companion, and still smiling, stated that she would soon find out everything that would happen in the future, and that she should not have worried so much, because all the questions and concerns would resolve themselves as soon as they were in place. Rudis looked up at the young man in confusion, her eyes filled with utter bewilderment, as she couldn't understand what he was talking about, and her thoughts were in a tangled mess, trying to grasp the meaning of his words, which seemed strange and had no clear connection to their current situation. The long-awaited day of the trip arrived, and the beauty sat in the carriage, dressed in a new dress, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and in her heart were mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety, because ahead lay a long and difficult journey full of unknown difficulties. The Duke's heir looked into the carriage window, his gaze confident, and he announced that they would soon arrive at their destination, not forgetting to add that he himself continued on his way on horseback, feeling the freedom and lightness that accompanied him on this journey. The lady, hearing his words, quietly replied that everything was fine, but her look became more serious, because she knew that they would soon have to get out of the carriage, and her mind was already preparing for what was to come when they arrived. There in the distance, flashes of red magic could be seen, as if chaos itself was raging in the heart of the city, tongues of scarlet fire that burned among the mountainous landscapes, creating an atmosphere of terror that quickly spread into the sky, suddenly filling the air with anxiety. The noblewoman felt ill. Her heart sank with fear when she saw such a nightmare in reality. Her gaze could not tear itself away from the burning skies, and she could not understand what was happening in the city, what caused this terrifying phenomenon. After apologizing to her companions, Rudis asked firmly what exactly the person who spoke of the final stage meant, as she could not grasp the full gravity of the situation, although her inner uneasiness grew with each new discovery. It turned out that there were 5 levels of infection in the Empire, each representing its own level of threat, and all of this raised serious questions about how soon they would find themselves in the midst of a catastrophe if they did not take the necessary measures. The young man hesitated a little, not knowing how to properly explain that the 5th stage was not the end of the infection, but only meant the transition to much more terrible and horrific consequences, and he tried to find the words to convey the seriousness of the situation. The lady shuddered when she heard that this stage meant the beginning of the ceremonies, which instantly filled her soul with anxiety and horror, for she could not imagine what monstrous rites could be associated with such horrors, and her heart beat faster with fear. Levane, riding alongside on horseback, noticed her confusion and calmly explained that people apparently felt that their end was coming, and that was why they called this last stage of infection that as if it were a sign of final death. Rudis, clearly intrigued, asked what they meant by these ceremonies, could not believe that monsters could have any conscious rituals, and with growing curiosity, added that, in her opinion, they could not have the intelligence to carry out such actions. Levine was dissatisfied with the fact that the aristocracy preferred to remain silent about such important and terrible aspects as the monster ceremonies, because it was not only scary, but also critical to their understanding of the situation and survival in this dangerous world. The Duke's heir, not knowing how to answer such an important question, continued riding silently, his gaze focused, and not the slightest sign of emotion reflected on his face. He seemed tired of this topic and simply preferred to leave it unanswered. Since the nobleman was not about to give an explanation, the god answered for him, explaining that during such ceremonies, the monsters turned people into monsters like themselves, infecting them with their powers, and will leaving behind only pitiful, disfigured creatures. The horror reflected on the beauty's face was full of genuine fear, because she did not expect to hear such a thing. Her mind could not contain such a terrible reality, and she felt a chill of fear run down her spine, making her heart beat faster. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed across the deserted road, fast and rhythmic, giving the impression that they were racing into the unknown, and the whole world around them was filled with those dark and mysterious forces that they were only just beginning to guess about. As he rode his horse, Levane said thoughtfully that when all humans were turned into monsters, the empire would fall and its future would become unclear, as such changes could destroy everything that was once great and invincible, leaving only ruins. Soon they decided to take a break, stopping the carriage for the night, and a small camp was set up around it. A fire was burning, tents were pitched, and the whole environment was filled with a sense of calm despite the anxiety that remained in their hearts. The beauty remained in the carriage, covered with a soft and fluffy blanket, her body trying to find rest, and she dozed, absorbed in thoughts that did not give her peace, and the silence of the night reigned around, only the fire quietly crackled. The Grand Duke's heir was awake, standing near the fire, his gaze fixed on Rudy's, his armor reflecting the fire in its metallic sheen, and he seemed to be part of this night, lost in thoughts of the future. The man came to apologize to her for not telling her earlier about the ceremonies held among the monsters, believing that it would be too scary and unreliable for her peace of mind, although now he felt that it was necessary to discuss it. Rudy's, understanding his situation, looked away as a sign that she understood, because they had neither the time nor the opportunity to talk about it as they should have, and they both knew very well that important things are often put off until later. However, despite her calmness, there was something that was troubling her, and she decided to ask directly whether the nobleman was going to kill the people who had been turned into monsters, because it was a matter of life and death, and she could no longer hide her concern. Seraphis froze, his face became serious, and after a few moments he recalled the words of Lord God, who had previously spoken about the people turned into monsters, emphasizing that they had lost their humanity, but remained an important element of this destroyed reality. Levane replied that there was no known way to turn people back from monsters, and therefore there was no other choice but to destroy them, which sounded cruel, but unfortunately, that was exactly the reality, and it could not be ignored. The girl clutched her gloves in her hands, her fingers trembling from the horror that gripped her mind, forcing her to think about the hopelessness of the situation, and she felt her heart squeezed with hopelessness and pain, unable to accept these cruel truths. Tears streamed down her face, and she began to understand that she could try to help those who were still alive, but monsters were not the people she wanted to save, and this thought greatly shook her soul. She was brought out of these terrible thoughts by the voice of the aristocrat Seraphis, who persistently called her, knowing how hard it was for her to accept such a thought, and although the words were painful, he tried to support her to give her the strength not to lose herself in this moment of despair. Placing his hand on the lady's palm, he promised that he would be there for her no matter what lay ahead, and that she should not worry, because she did not have to take on all the weight of responsibility when there was someone nearby who was ready to help. Rudy's blushed at these words, because no one had ever supported her in this way before, and this simple but warm care awakened feelings in her heart that she had not experienced for a long time. Support and hope became her best friends at that moment. The young man concluded his speech by asking the noblewoman to at least get some rest, as tomorrow would be a difficult day, and she must be prepared for the trials that lay ahead, because despite her fatigue, there was still much ahead. The man took a step forward, his iron boots clanking softly on the road, breaking the silence of the night, and he headed towards the camp to continue his preparations, but there was peace in his heart, knowing that he had done everything to support her. Seriphus walked forward, lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the void, as if he was trying to find answers in the misty abyss of the night. Each step slow and careful, the air around him feeling cold and heavy. His green eyes, full of deep thought, watched the scene before him with wary eyes, and his brows were furrowed, as if he was trying to decipher some hidden meaning in that dark, impenetrable void. There was an impenetrable darkness, all around which swallowed everything, hiding every detail from view, but almost imperceptibly, the first light of dawn began to break through it softly, illuminating the black trees and giving them a mysterious, threatening expression. Rudy's, tired from a sleepless night, was still struggling with himself, trying to resist the temptation to close his eyes and fall asleep, realizing that the night would be difficult and perhaps decisive for what awaited them in the dark depths of this world. Without thinking twice, she stepped out of the carriage, and as soon as she stepped on the ground, she felt the cold penetrate her body, causing instant anxiety, and the cold air was so sharp that she involuntarily shuddered trying to warm up, but nothing could help her. Suddenly, unexpectedly for her, a man's hands appeared from behind, and she felt a warm cloak fall softly and carefully on her shoulders, which was an incredible relief, as if all the cold had disappeared, giving way to the comfort and security that he brought with his gesture. It was Lavaine who could not help but notice that the Duke's heir had come to the lady at such a late hour, and despite his calm demeanor, anxiety and jealousy were growing in his soul, and he was dissatisfied with what was happening, because such night visits were not part of his usual perception. The two of them stood near the fire, which burned with a dim light, illuminating their figures in this almost complete darkness, and their conversation sounded quiet, and the words seemed almost imperceptible, but despite the silence, they both felt that something was inevitably approaching. The man deliberately stood closer to his interlocutor so that his words could be heard, and his gaze became more attentive, as if each of his words had been carefully weighed and deliberately brought closer to her so that she would definitely hear it. And then, Lavaine, with an expression of genuine interest on his face, asked if she really liked such tender words and good deeds, as if he wanted to make sure that his efforts were not in vain, and she appreciated his attention. The beauty struck by his words froze in place, unable to immediately find an answer. Her eyes widened in shock, and her mouth opened in surprise. She could not believe such frank words, and all she could do was remain silent, in complete stunned silence, not knowing what to say. Hearing that people loved to hear kind words addressed to them, Lavaine did not resist, although he did not know this before, since he was a god, and did not attach importance to such trifles for him. It was nothing more than a game, and despite all his arrogance, he agreed. After which the man reminded her that she needed him more than this pompous air of the Duke, and his words sounded like self-importance, as if he was the one who could give her more than the one she apparently preferred. The conversation was suddenly interrupted, as it was time to continue on his way, and Lavaine, without paying any attention to her, walked forward with a quick step, leaving the lady behind. He did not consider it necessary to wait for her, as if her presence did not matter for his further steps. The sound of the wheels on the road, drowning out all thoughts and conversations, was lulling as the carriage moved slowly along the winding road, its wheels creaking, and each new turn seemed to take them further from that moment, leaving behind the shadows of past events. Seriphus stopped the vehicle, his gaze determined, as he announced that they could no longer continue on wheels and would have to walk his words, leaving no room for doubt, as if it was inevitable and the only right decision. He helped the young beauty out of the luxurious carriage, stepping down to the ground next to her, and they both found themselves among the couples of people who passed by, oblivious to their presence, but their footsteps echoed in the void. Rudy's felt a strange sense of unease wash over her, as if there was an elusive aura of oppression hovering around her, and she could sense chaos, hatred, and dark magic filling the air, creating the feeling of an ominous presence. Before them appeared the former city, engulfed in the infection stage, its fifth level, where the sky was red, as if drenched in blood, and everything around looked like hell on earth, where monsters lived, hiding in the darkness, ready to attack at any moment. The nobleman ordered his subjects to wait for the red flare, and if anything went wrong, they were to leave immediately and inform the emperor, his voice full of confidence, as if he already knew that the situation could get out of control. Levane stated that it would have actually been wiser for the man to remain outside, as he did not know what might await them inside, and did not want to risk the safety of someone who, in fact, could be superfluous in this dangerous mission, having no experience in such matters. But the young man was stubborn, and firmly declared that he was going to go with them. Despite all the warnings, his determination was ironclad, and nothing could change his intention to go to the end, even if it meant exposing himself to danger. Levane finally agreed to take him along, and seeing that everyone was ready, he declared with determination that the time had come to move forward, not allowing himself to waste a second in doubt, because an unknown path full of dangers awaited them. All around them was a scene of destruction and chaos. Houses were in endless ruins, mud and blood were spilled everywhere, and the atmosphere itself emanated a terrible tyranny of fate that swallowed everything in its path, leaving no trace of life. On the ground among the ruins, skeletons and skulls lay mercilessly, their terrible eyes seeming to still be searching for salvation, and every step they took led to new victims, giving this place a feeling of the end of the world. The noblewoman, seeing this nightmare, could not hold back a nervous laugh, trying to somehow alleviate her own fear, but soon feeling the full seriousness of the situation, she shrank, and without realizing it, moved closer to the nobleman, seeking protection and peace in him. They continued to walk forward, and Levane quietly said that there was still hope of finding someone alive because the sky had not yet turned completely scarlet, and this was a small but important sign that all was not lost. The noblewoman trembled with horror, unable to comprehend that everything around her was so terrible. Her mind could not get used to this destroyed reality, which seemed beyond all logic and human perception. The future duke, noticing her inner unrest, tried to console the lady, assuring her that she should not blame herself for what was happening, because this catastrophe, full of destruction, pain, and irreparable losses, was not her fault, and there was no one who could stop this nightmare. Turning around, she asked which way the monsters were heading, her voice full of anxiety, and feeling the gravity of the situation. She added that they needed to hurry to try to save those who were still alive, because every minute was worth its weight in gold. Seraphis sighed, his face darkening for a moment. He could barely contain his irritation, but despite everything, he firmly promised that they would lead them through these lands as quickly as possible, regardless of the difficulties, because time was worth its weight in gold, and there was no room for delay. Levane, watching the young couple out of the corner of his eye, felt a strange pang of jealousy. His gaze was sharp, but hidden, full of displeasure, as he was jealous of his mistress for this young man. But he remained silent, knowing that his feelings could not interfere with this dangerous mission. The sky above them continued to burn scarlet like blood, and clouds, like dark spots, spread across the horizon, obscuring the light, creating an unsettling atmosphere where it was difficult to understand what awaited them ahead in this merciless and dying world. The lady walked forward at a quick pace, trying not to slow down, but the duke followed her, constantly shouting at her to slow down immediately because the pace was too fast, and they needed to be more careful in this dangerous situation. At that moment, Levane, sensing her tension and anxiety, hugged the princess, asking if she was okay, inquiring about her condition, as if caring about her emotional state, because he knew how hard it was to endure all these horrors. Seraphis also did not hesitate, and having carefully examined the princess, inquired about her condition, noticing that her face was unusually pale, which indicated her inner turmoil and perhaps physical exhaustion. Since Levane was not human, he had a much easier time coping with these harsh conditions. He was hardened by years of existence, without knowing weakness or fear, which gave him strength and confidence in the most difficult situations. As for the aristocrat himself, he was also hardened by war and many battles on the battlefield, and therefore was not afraid of any danger, knowing that in a world full of destruction, it was not the first time he would face dangers and survive in the harshest conditions. Compared to them, Rudy's felt weak, insignificant, and pathetic. Her body and spirit were devastated, and her thoughts were filled with hopelessness because her strength and determination paled in comparison to those who walked beside her, unwavering in their steadfastness. At that moment, the duke, noticing her fatigue and exhaustion, picked up the lady in his arms, not thinking about the difficulties, because for him there was no obstacle in helping her, and with determination he continued on his way, despite all the dangers that lay in wait for them. Finally, they arrived at the place where the monsters gathered. Before them stood an ancient fortress, engulfed in bloody darkness and malice, the walls of which seemed to embody the very essence of horror, surrounding everything within a radius of hundreds of meters with darkness and an ominous atmosphere. The doors of the fortress were covered in thick traces of blood, and a symbol imbued with black magic was burned into them, emitting a dark aura, as if these gates were a spell that led to inevitable suffering and destruction of everything in its path. Seriphus sat down next to the gate and thought for a moment, then with a determined expression declared that in order to get inside, they would have to break down these ancient doors by force, as other methods seemed ineffective against such a powerful barrier. Lavaine, however, stepped forward and confidently said that there was no point in breaking anything because there was another, less destructive way to get in, and he was sure that this way they could get inside without the risk of destroying the magical barriers. The man quietly said that as soon as Rudy saw the scary and terrible monsters, she should immediately give the order, and he would decide everything for her without a second's delay because he was ready to carry out any order without thinking about the consequences. The boy was only able to act on her orders because his presence here was the result of a ritual in which she was a victim, and obeying the will of the one who summoned him, he was bound by strict rules that obliged him to help her without the right to refuse. The girl hesitated, not knowing what order to give that would not only demonstrate her strength, but also feel in control of the situation, because her internal conflict was eroding her confidence, forcing her to hesitate before an important decision. The gates of the great fortress were locked, but through their thick doors came ominous sounds, darkness screams, and the growling of monsters that seemed ready to unleash their fury, filling the air with a terrible omen of doom. Rudy spoke aloud, asking the god to open the door so they could pass through, and her words echoed in the stillness of the night like a magical call, filling the air with tension, like a call to ancient powers, ready to answer. With the help of magic, the doors began to slowly and mysteriously open, as if obeying ancient laws, and a path opened before them, as if fate itself favored their decision, causing the young people to pause for a moment at the entrance, ready to take a step into the unknown. The Duke turned amazed at what was happening, and said in surprise that the gates were open, and now nothing was stopping them from entering, and a strange feeling of uncertainty came over him, as if reality itself had begun to change. Lavaine, without a moment's hesitation, confidently and decisively, stepped forward, heading into the dark depths of the fortress, and behind him, not lagging behind, walked the beauty, her gaze focused, and her heart pounding wildly in her chest, anticipating all the trials that they would have to endure in this ominous place. All around chaos raged, destruction and disorder engulfed everything in its path, and people without stopping and not paying attention to the inevitable dangers continued their grueling journey along the destroyed road, desperately trying to survive in this darkness. A drop of crimson blood fell slowly onto her hair, like a slow-motion moment, and she involuntarily winced, feeling the unpleasant touch that this stain caused, because blood always brought with it associations with something dark and sinister. The guy, realizing the danger of the situation, stood in front of the lady, covering her with himself, and in a decisive and calm tone, told her not to look at the terrifying nightmare that was unfolding around her, and to immediately go upstairs, where there could be at least some protection. He didn't waste time explaining why it was worth going up, knowing that every moment could be decisive for their survival. And instead of words, he simply ordered her to hurry so that they wouldn't end up trapped. The rocky walls, coated in a thick layer of dirt, reflected the destruction that had engulfed the entire city. Desolation and chaos reigned everywhere, and the city itself, enveloped in this terrifying dust cloud, began to resemble an unrecognizable ruin consumed by the elements of destruction. There, on the steps in front of the couple, the dark figure of Lavaine suddenly appeared, his long cloak blocking the passage, and without haste, he addressed Rudis in a decisive and cold tone, ordering her to move towards him immediately without wasting a minute because every second counted in a dangerous situation. Extending his hand forward, the man insistently told her to come to him right now, without delay, realizing that time was not only money, but also life, and that delay could cost them everything they had left in this world full of threats. The noblewoman, trembling with fear and a sense of hopelessness, could not hold back her tears. Her heart was breaking with pain and despair, because everything she once knew seemed to be crumbling right before her eyes, and there was no hope in sight. Without thinking twice, she extended her hand as a last chance accepted help, and squeezed the young man's hand, feeling in his strong grip not only physical support, but also some spark of hope that could help her survive this terrible moment. Immediately, Levane, without wasting a second, pulled the lady to himself, pressed her to his chest, as if trying to protect her from everything that was happening around, wrapping her in his dark cloak, hiding her from the merciless glances and inevitable dangers of this crumbling world. The man, noticing the woman's anxiety, gently but firmly ordered her not to worry, assuring her that she would soon understand everything and that the most important thing now was not to give in to panic, but to follow him so that they could get out of this deadly situation. Rudy's, staring at her companion in surprise, didn't know what to answer, but despite her inner doubts, she decided not to object, because at that moment, it was difficult for her to orient herself, and his confidence inspired at least a small but hope. Once they reached the top, they found themselves in a room whose walls were covered with drawings that were an inexorable reminder of destruction. Dirt, blood, dark traces of magic, left by long-gone forces, gave this place an eerie and ominous appearance. The Duke's heir walked beside the lady, holding a sword in his hand, ready to protect her at any moment, as if he knew that in this world danger lurked around every corner, and he was ready to face her face to ensure her safety. Slowly, carefully, the beauty extended her fragile hand and opened the door, and immediately a bright light poured into the room, illuminating the space, as if inviting them into an unknown world where every movement could be decisive. When they reached the roof, their gaze was met with a terrible sight. A huge and ominous seal was depicted on the floor, and the souls of the dead were flying across the sky, ghosts, whose screams tore through the silence, filling the air with fear and horror. A variety of breathtaking monsters circled tirelessly around their shadows, flickering in the dim light, and an ominous whisper hung in the air, as if they were talking to each other, ready to attack at any moment. Some of them were perched on the ledges of the roof. The demons, with their mouths open and their evil eyes blazing, whispered among themselves, and their whispers filled the air like a curse, and the scarlet sky, like a bloody shroud, hung low, creating an atmosphere of evil menace that thickened with every moment. The young noblewoman burst into tears when one of the monsters noticed them, and her heart fluttered in fear, for at that moment it seemed to her that the end was coming, and that everything they had endured so far was meaningless in the face of this terrible fate. The monsters immediately began to attack them, and the future duke, without thinking about himself, stood in front with a sword ready to fight to the last, not intending to retreat and to protect her at any cost, even if it meant facing inevitable death. A huge clawed paw, like a shadow of horror, reached out to the beauty, and she froze in fear, unable to move. Her mind was seized with horror, and her body seemed to be paralyzed, not yielding to the slightest movement. The lady, unable to bear the tension and fear for her life, screamed, begging Levane to protect them and find a way to turn these monsters back into people, hoping for his strength and determination, because she saw no other way out of this terrifying nightmare. When the blow did not come, and the lovely girl remained alive, she opened her eyes in surprise, deciding to find out what had happened, because in her mind there was only one thing: she should have already been dead, but this world continued to exist around her. There ahead stood Levane, and around him were many ordinary citizens, who as if by magic had returned to their human form. Everyone was alive and well, and the scarlet sky, which had previously been so ominous, gradually turned blue, clearing itself of dark omens. People, looking at themselves in amazement, were delighted to discover that they had returned to their former human form, and their hearts were filled with happiness and joy that they had once again become what they were before this terrible transformation. The noblewoman was in complete shock at what had just happened, and her mind, trying to comprehend what was happening, had difficulty grasping these events, until the god explained that all this was the fulfillment of her sincere wish, as if the universe itself had responded to her request. Pressing his hand to her face, Levane said tenderly and affectionately that everything had happened exactly as she had wished, that her wish had been fulfilled, and now, despite everything she had experienced, she could find at least a little peace, because all the fears and horrors that had seemed inevitable were finally behind her. The table in the room was massive, made of stone, and its cold surface added heaviness, while the conversations and whispers of people returning to life created an atmosphere of truce between fear and hope, as if reality itself was falling into place again. This building became their temporary refuge, and the Duke, with coolness and determination, gave orders, helping the citizens so that they could calm down a little while. Rudy, sitting to the side, absorbed in her thoughts, tried to understand what exactly had happened. She was still gripped by panic. Her body continued to tremble from what she had experienced, and the sweat that continued to flow down her face did not hide the horror that continued to live in her eyes, as if she could not believe that all this was true, that she had actually survived. Her palms, despite her efforts to calm herself, still trembled, and a painful weakness clung to her. Even sitting safely, she felt ill, as if her soul still couldn't free itself from the shadow of fear that had left an indelible mark on her body and mind. Everything ended well. The brave Levane saved everyone, and using his powers was able to return the monsters back to their human forms, giving them a second life and a chance to recover, which was a true miracle, no matter how impossible it seemed. Rudis was filled with horror, for she knew perfectly well that what the god would do depended on her will, for her power and ability to control his actions could change everything, and she looked at her hand with alarm, feeling the weight of this burden. Levane stood a little to the side, his black cloak tightly buttoned and his shirt neatly concealing his figure. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, not interfering in the events, or helping the citizens watching the events with cold equanimity. Then Seraphis suddenly turned to the princess, saying that the people would very much like to properly greet her and express their gratitude for her help, for saving them, and for giving their world a chance to recover again. The sweet noblewoman, slightly confused and surprised, could not understand why it was she, and not the duke or the god, who attracted attention, because her status was not so outstanding in comparison with them, and everything that was happening seemed a little strange to her. The noblewoman, not fully aware of her own beauty, cast a quick glance at her companion, who stood next to the weapon and took no part in the conversation. His silence only increased the feeling of distance between him and all the other interlocutors. Deciding that it would be beneficial to everyone, the aristocrat agreed, and rising from her seat, walked forward, ready to go with the duke, realizing that her participation in this gesture was more important than it seemed at first glance, and would have long-term consequences. In the corridor, ordinary citizens were already waiting for them. The entire young couple was surrounded by people who loudly thanked the princess for saving her, and did not stop expressing their gratitude joyfully, raising their hands, and loudly shouting in thanks. Suddenly, a lady in a cloak with a short skirt came forward. She was a descendant of a noble family, and her name was Alcester Bellona, and thanking the princess, she said that now her family would be indebted to her, and they would repay this debt. Rudis loudly objected, asking whether they should not have praised the emperor, and not this pathetic princess, who in her opinion did not deserve attention since she was unremarkable and could not compare with the greatness of the real ruler. Alcester Bellona calmly replied that everyone knew how things really were, and that was why they thanked her, because her fight and her strength were meant to protect people, and not the cruel and heartless tyrant who had long ruled this world. Everyone in the city had turned their backs on them, believing that saving these monsters was pointless because they were already dead to the world, and the scarlet sky above their heads was a vivid and disturbing reminder of the fall of everything that once existed, destroyed by merciless cruelty. The lady, realizing her boldness and rudeness, asked for forgiveness, but then, bowing her head with deep respect and sincerity, asked the beauty to accept her oath of allegiance and promised to serve, hoping that her sincere desire to be useful and faithful would be accepted with gratitude. The noblewoman stood in shock, not fully comprehending how radically all these people had changed and how their destinies were now intertwined with hers, because she could not imagine that such fateful moments could so dramatically change her life and the entire world around her. All the townspeople began to smile when Rudis accepted their oath, and happiness filled their hearts, because now they felt they belonged to something greater, feeling like they were part of a great cause, ready to dedicate themselves to serving the princess and protect her to the last. Now they all became subjects of the princess, swearing to protect her, to become her weapon and sword, to follow her every command without hesitation, without thinking about their own safety, for the sake of fulfilling their duty and loyalty to their oath. People diligently packing the carriage for the aristocrat were preparing for her return journey, while others were taking care to collect all the necessary things and supplies for the long and difficult journey that lay ahead, because the road was full of trials. Meanwhile, Rudy sat in a warm blanket next to the fire, feeling the cold creep into her body, but trying to warm herself up. She enjoyed the brief moment of peace, thinking about what lay ahead and what trials she would have to overcome. The man's hand reached for her hair, And noticing this, the god realized how tired the lady was. Her face expressed an almost lifeless heaviness, and her eyes, full of exhaustion, seemed to have begun to lose their ability to see, and she was almost falling asleep right there. However, as soon as the hand came close, Rudy slapped her palm away with surprising speed, and a mixture of horror and fear appeared in her eyes, as if she had imagined something terrible that made her feel an invisible threat in the air. Levine, realizing that his movement could have frightened the girl, apologized with sincere regret, calmly explaining that he did not mean to frighten her and that his intentions were completely innocent, but her shocked face could not go unnoticed. When she finally recognized him as her friend, her face lit up with instant relief, and the sigh she had been holding in for so long burst from her chest, and the fear and tension that had been gripping her instantly disappeared, giving way to peace. The man tilted his head slightly to the side, studying her with an indescribable interest, and noticing the expression of fear on her face, asked with slight surprise why she was so afraid of him, because her fear was not obvious to him, and even strange, as if he could not understand. Then he added in a reserved and cold tone that unfortunately nothing could be done about it. Such was his nature. He was a god, not a man, and at times his actions could be cruel, but this was a part of his essence that could not be changed. Rudy's pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to contain a storm of emotions, and asked with slight excitement why he continued to obey her, whether it was only because she helped him get out of chaos and get into this world despite his power. After all, he had previously promised that he would always believe her, no matter what she said, and that her words and actions would always mean the most to him. So why did her loyalty now seem so dubious and unconvincing? The young man always protected her, saved her, hugged and consoled her, and it seemed that his heart was not capable of containing any other feelings than those caused only by sincere care and duty. But deep down, he could no longer hide the real experiences that were beginning to pull in the other direction. However, at some point, Levane admitted that he actually did feel something for her, and his help was not just a matter of duty, but was dictated by internal emotions that he did not want to acknowledge. However, after a moment of silence, he finally added that he could not reveal to her the real reason why he always obeyed her words without question, because this reason was so deeply personal and hidden that he did not feel ready to open up and explain it. The fire burned brightly, its flames soaring high into the night sky, illuminating everything around, creating a magical atmosphere, and the crackling wood, as if alive, danced in the fiery vortex, forming a mesmerizing picture that seemed to capture the very essence of fire magic. The lovely lady, with obvious interest, asked if she could use his extraordinary power to restore at least part of the destroyed city, believing that his abilities could help her cope with this difficult and important task. The man explained that, although it was extremely difficult and involved a lot of effort, he could still try to fulfill her request because his strength allowed him to do so, although he would have to face many difficulties. And then he added that if the gentle lady made such great demands on him, she should pay him a corresponding price to deserve his help in such an important and difficult matter, since his efforts and time could not be wasted. The noblewoman shuddered at these words, and feeling a surge of determination within her, her eyes flashed with fire, and with fury in her voice, she shouted that she would never sacrifice herself, no matter what demands or expectations were made of her. The man covered his face with his hand, as if hiding a grin, and gently explained that the sacrifice was not at all necessary. He only wanted something else from her, something much simpler, something that would not require such excruciating sacrifice and deprivation on her part. Rudis waited patiently for him to continue trying to figure out what exactly the man wanted in exchange for his help, but he suddenly interrupted himself, and with a slight hint of doubt in his voice, said that he was not yet ready to reveal his intentions to her. Then Levane, with a careful and gentle movement, covered her with the blanket, which slipped slightly from her shoulders, and looking at her thoughtfully, said that everything that was really important would be revealed later, when the moment came when she was ready to hear the revelations. After this, the nobleman gently asked the lovely lady to rest and recuperate, and he himself, quietly and unnoticed, left the room, leaving her alone, so that she could be left alone with her own thoughts, immersed in the silence of the night, full of reflection and anticipation. The lady, sitting on a log near a brightly blazing fire, watched in amazement, as the endless sky, strewn with stars, twinkled beautifully around the majestic tower of the fortress, creating a feeling of complete peace and comfort in the silence of the night. Soon they continued on their way. The horse-drawn carriage rolled along the winding road, and the earth beneath the hooves responded with a dull thud, filling everything around with a quiet and rhythmic sound, as if nature itself was watching their movement. When they arrived at the place, they were already eagerly awaited. The gates of the fortress were wide open, and the transport drove inside without any obstacles, leaving the feeling that everything was ready for their arrival, and they arrived just in time. The servants, meeting their masters with warm and gracious smiles, greeted them with joy, assuring them that everything had been carefully prepared for their comfortable stay, and looked forward to the moment when they could fulfill all their requests, ready to satisfy their needs. Rudy's and the future Duke were sitting quietly in the room, lost in their thoughts, when suddenly a guest entered the door and immediately attracted their attention with his unexpected visit, breaking the silence and creating a feeling of something important and disturbing in the air. It was the butler, who stood on the threshold, visibly worried, and apologized to his masters for his interference and for having come without waiting with news immediately after their long, tiring journey, interrupting their rest. The nobles, hearing these words and seeing the expression on the servant's face, simultaneously shuddered, feeling a growing anxiety grip them because they understood that the servant was bringing important news, hoping that the news would be less unpleasant than they could have imagined. Many luxurious gifts were sent, including boxes of precious jewelry and rare valuables, each of which was a clear testimony of the respect and admiration addressed to the dear Rudis. Dear Rudis was in complete shock, unable to believe that all these magnificent things were actually given to her because she could not understand how so many people at the same time could show such incredible generosity and attention to her. The servant explained that in the first 5 days after the princess's departure, people perceived her as a fraud and did not trust her, which certainly influenced how she was received in her new environment, where mistrust and caution reigned. But soon after the important event occurred, the guards came to the emperor with important news that led to significant changes in the princess's position, as well as to an improvement in her reputation in the eyes of the rulers and their inner circle. The ruler of the empire, turning around in confusion, asked the guard what he wanted from him because his thoughts were preoccupied with what was happening in the capital, and it was difficult for him to concentrate on one thing at that moment when everything around him seemed so unusual. The man, looking at the clear blue sky, realized that the city had been freed from the monsters, and although it was difficult for him to believe what was happening, he nevertheless began to understand that such a thing was only possible in the most incredible situations that had previously seemed like fantasy to him. A few minutes passed, and stuttering slightly, he said that from now on, all the capital's attention would be focused on Rudis, who, despite her role, was increasingly becoming a symbol of the city's salvation, a savior whose name would be written into history. The future hero noticed how quickly the nobles' attitude toward the princess, whom they had previously despised and considered unworthy, had changed, but now that the situation had changed, their views began to transform toward respect and even admiration. Looking over at the lady next to him, the man added that Earl Abbot had probably offered her a helping hand, and that his attitude towards her had become considerably more friendly, which was a noticeable and important step in how he began to perceive her and her place among others. Rudis turned away from the man's gaze because she was not thinking about the nobles. After all, so much had happened in the last few days, and her thoughts were occupied with completely different matters that required much more of her attention and concentration. Looking up with determination, the lady realized that she could no longer sit idly by and decided that it was time to leave the old place and move to a new house right now without delay, because the moment of change in her life had come that could not be missed. The dress was white with a beautiful hem decorated with barely noticeable lace, which gave the image incredible lightness and elegance, perfectly reflecting her new status, which was now obvious to everyone around her, as if emphasizing her changes. The main palace of the imperial palace, bowing slightly, approached the other servants, greeting the princess before them, who seemed to be becoming an increasingly important figure for palace life and all its inhabitants with each passing day. The man was old. His wrinkles betrayed years of work, his narrow eyes hid his disinterest, and his gray hair and tense expression indicated that he was extremely unfriendly and not ready to show warm feelings. Rudis carefully examined the man, who had not previously participated in her beating, but also did not stop those who approached her, as if he did not want to interfere, and remained a bystander, which caused her mixed feelings. The servant, responding coldly and reservedly, informed her that the emperor was already waiting for her in his chambers, leaving no room for questions or confusion, emphasizing that the visit was expected and had to take place immediately without delay on the woman's part. The lady shuddered, feeling a slight uneasiness, and immediately noted that usually only his favorites were allowed to enter the ruler's rooms, which became the reason for her wariness, since such a visit could mean something more than just politeness. The butler insisted that the emperor himself had given permission and personally called her daughter into his chambers, which sounded strange, but nevertheless he assured that the order came from the ruler himself and her presence there was absolutely necessary. When they finally reached their destination, the servant, out of old habit, announced the lady's arrival at the palace, after which, having fulfilled his duty, he silently withdrew, leaving the father and daughter alone, where their meeting could undoubtedly become an important moment for both parties. Bartold stood in the room, his back to the lady, and she, patiently waiting for her father, the emperor, to begin the conversation, felt how every moment stretched into infinity, and her nerves, despite all the outward restraint, began to succumb to excitement, exacerbated by the long wait. The emperor, noticing that the lady had finally come to him, irritably declared that he had been waiting for her arrival for a long time and that she should have appeared earlier, since along with her, he was also expecting the arrival of the young gentleman with whom he had to discuss important matters. The conversation was about a sir named Levane, who at that moment was relaxing on the sofa, in no hurry to get up and show activity, thereby adding even more irritation to the atmosphere because his presence could be connected with something serious. The ruler, deciding to once again play the role of a caring father, said tensely and insincerely that he was glad that the lady had returned home safe and sound, although his words were merely formal, concealing deep-seated discontent and hidden anger about what was happening. After which, the man, trying to appear interested, asked if it had been difficult for her and how she had managed to deal with the monsters so easily, as if he himself could not believe that all this had happened so simply and without any extra effort on the woman's part. The man was filled with enthusiasm, greed, and a desire for power when he learned that his daughter truly possessed the kind of power that could be the key to his ambitions, and he realized that her powers could prove invaluable to his own plans. A smirk appeared on the ruler's face as he with some satisfaction shared the news that he had recently learned of the high priest and his connection with the sacrifice, as well as the connection with the summoned god, which seemed to leave no room for doubt as to his intentions. Rudy's, intrigued, but still confused, listened to him, not understanding why he was even raising such an old topic that seemed to have been long forgotten, and why it had suddenly come up again in the conversation if it had no particular significance for the current situation. Then, in the blink of an eye, the man pushed his daughter hard against the wall, his hands grabbed her shoulders harshly, and she couldn't help but react, wincing in surprise and shock, feeling the full weight of his strength and determination, which made her heart beat at double speed. The ruler, looking at his daughter gloomily and emotionlessly, suggested to her that Selena could become the victim instead of her. His words were full of cold calculation, and his gaze, devoid of any regret, demonstrated a complete lack of moral hesitation regarding such an idea. The noblewoman froze in complete shock, unable to believe her ears. Her mind could not immediately comprehend such words, and she felt her blood slowly cooling in her veins, and her heart sank from shock and complete disbelief at what was happening before her eyes. At this time, the god, sitting on the sofa, could not hold back his laughter, surprised by the stupidity of the ruler of the empire, whose actions and decisions were so naive and devoid of any wisdom that even this supernatural being could not help but mock. The man began to laugh loudly, his laughter filled with bewilderment, echoing throughout the room, and the father and daughter, unable to understand the reason for such laughter, simultaneously turned to him, perplexed by what could have made the young man so amused in such a tense and serious situation. The guy, still laughing, explained with surprise that it was the first time he had heard such a ridiculous proposal from someone to sacrifice his second daughter, uttered without any logic, as if it were not an important decision, but not a question on which the fate of an entire life depended. But soon the young man's face became serious and impassive, and Levane, with a terrible look, declared that the man was a short-sighted fool since he could not distinguish where the heavens began and where the earth ended, not understanding what consequences awaited him for such a naive decision. The ruler began to tremble with fear. His hands shook slightly, and his words seemed to get stuck in his throat. The man looked anxiously at his interlocutor, trying to find the right phrases, but in his soul he felt that he might say something wrong, which would further aggravate his situation. The god was silent, his gaze attentive, and inside there was a quiet, slow process going on, as if he was trying to understand whether the emperor understood the true meaning of the terrible word sacrifice and what consequences it could have for everyone associated with this concept. When the young man explained that the victim dies quickly, giving up his blood and flesh, the ruler flinched, his face contorted in incomprehension, and he pointed at Rudy's, trying to understand why she survived. But Selena, in his opinion, could not survive. The guy, holding back his emotions, replied that Rudy's was unique, she was different from everyone else, and her survival was a consequence of the enormous price she paid, unlike others, and it was this price that gave her a chance to continue living. For the young noblewoman, these words were a real revelation, because the girl could not remember what price she had already paid to herself and God, and this left her in deep thought, creating a feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. Levane sat in his chair, his body tense with fatigue, but his face remained calm and focused, as if he was ready to take on any turn of events, remaining unshaken, despite all the storm of emotions that raged around him. At this time, loud screams were heard in the second princess's chambers, echoing throughout the room. She was sitting on the bed, and ladies and servants were fussing around her, trying to calm her down, but the anxiety and chaos only increased with each passing minute. Selena was extremely unhappy that her father allowed this cur, named Rudy's, to enter his chambers, especially since she had dirty blood, which she considered insufficient for those who dared to be in his companies. Ivana, sitting next to the huge bed, said with firmness in her voice that she personally saw her sister the princess enter her father's chambers, and her words sounded like irrefutable evidence, fully confirming her version of events. Selena, holding back a furious outburst of irritation, clenched her teeth, unable to accept the fact that the emperor would so easily leave everything behind, as if he would forget about his beloved daughter, as if her feelings and dignity had no value in his eyes. Ivana suddenly smiled, and then, as if by chance, reminded that the ruler had previously given the room to his mistress's sister, which came as a shock to Selena because she could not believe that her father was capable of changing his allegiances so easily. This revelation was a real blow to the gut for the lady, because she could not even imagine that her father would so quickly lose all affection for her, choosing instead that stupid Rudy's, whom she considered unworthy of such attention and love. The glass shattered on the cold floor with a loud clang, and screams of despair and pain echoed throughout the room, creating an atmosphere of hopelessness that fell upon everyone present, causing their hearts to clench with tension. Selena, unable to contain her storm of emotions, began to cry loudly, screaming in despair that she would never give up her hated sister, who was so loved by her father, and she would do everything possible to maintain her position. The servants standing quietly behind the princess carried out her every order, with restraint and patiently hiding their feelings and worries, steadfastly enduring her whims and insecurities, being mere silent witnesses to this stormy scene unfolding right before them. At this time, Ivana hid her satisfied smile under her hand, realizing that her cunning plan against the royal family had finally begun to bear fruit, and her manipulations had achieved their goal, destroying everything that seemed unshakable. When the conversation with the emperor ended, Rudy's, overcome with fatigue and depression, left the office, and feeling the weight of what was happening, leaned helplessly against the wall, unable to contain the emotions raging inside her, thinking about how her life was once again in danger. The father threw her out, fully aware that his futile plan had no chance of success, deep in thought as to how he could ever believe that a god would succumb to his manipulation for his ambitious goals if he sacrificed his second beloved daughter. Suddenly, the handsome Mr. Levane, holding out his hand to Rudy's, appeared before her, with such an expression on his face that she, a little surprised, froze, and for a moment could not understand what was happening. Her heart was beating faster from surprise and excitement. The young man, with a slight smile on his lips, explained that, observing other people, He saw how those who value each other with warmth and care take their loved ones by the arm and walk in this single step as if sharing all the moments of life, and that is why he wanted to do the same. He added that he absolutely did not want to hurt her, but on the contrary, he tried to show her tenderness and care, because in her presence, he felt his heart fill with warmth and kindness, and he wanted to be as attentive and affectionate with her as possible. Rudy's looking away and hesitating a bit, said in a restrained voice that she was simply deeply upset by everything that was happening, but despite this, she did not feel any fear of him, because in her soul, there was much more anxiety and worry than fear of this gesture. From the very beginning, she did not place any hope in the god, realizing that his powers were immeasurable and far beyond her understanding. But despite this, she did not turn away from him, sensing how he could influence her fate at any moment, although she did not want this. The young man, hearing her assurance that she was not upset, could not believe her words, because his eyes immediately noticed that look, full of pain and worry, which she could not hide, despite all her efforts to maintain outward calm. The guy, taking a step back and noticing her internal struggle, said with a slight regret in his voice that despite everything that had happened, he would not blame her or press her. He would simply wait for her decisions and be ready to follow her orders, assuring her that he was on her side despite the circumstances. The lady, ready to answer and express her opinion, had already opened her mouth, but before she could utter a word, because at that moment the god suddenly turned to dust, dissolved into the air, and disappeared, leaving her in confusion, feeling how anxiety fettered her thoughts and did not give her peace. A new day had dawned, and in a duchy renowned for its architectural grandeur and extraordinary beauty, the air was thick with the feeling of a new beginning, as if the land itself were preparing for great change. The lovely Rudies stood before the palace with a determined expression on her face and her hand firmly placed on her chest, firmly declaring that she was going to Geheim to visit the ancient temple, where she sought spiritual peace and tranquility. The man immediately offered his help, ready to send his man to the church if she had important business there, but the lady politely refused, expressing a firm desire to personally visit this holy place in order to fulfill her duty herself. Taking in the beauty around her, she quietly said that her visit to the church was connected with her friend God, and that she hoped to receive important information that could open new paths for her and answers to her questions. The words of the young man came to mind, who said that Rudies had already paid her price, and therefore she no longer needed to give her blood and flesh, for her duty was already fulfilled, and further sacrifices would be superfluous and unnecessary.